Hello, everyone, and welcome on the public space. I'm always very enthusiastic every Monday. I mean, Monday has been the most terrible day in all my life. It's never been a day of any interest. There's never been good stuff on TV. But now that I make my own TV, I can put something very important every Monday, and it's the Frame Game Special Report. How are you doing, Frame Game?
I'm doing great. This is going to be a fun one tonight. I'm really excited to go over it with you.
With all the information you bring to this show, it's amazing that you don't come in with a depression. Have you just learned to be resilient to black pills?
You know what? I think of it like a wave, right? You're kind of like surfing the emotion of it. And what I'm hoping to do is I guess part of it is like if it builds up over a certain number of years, each sequential black pill has like marginally less effect on making you feel hopeless. And so if you absorb it slowly over time, I think it makes you stronger.
So you have a resilience that develops after a certain amount of black pills. Now, today, I find that the subject is not so black pilling. The situation of media is dramatic, in my view, but it's amazing to see that the attempts are so transparent at controlling information. And ultimately, this is what we'll show today. It's that the entire media system is an information control system that's not built for you, the audience. It's built for the people who pay for these media, because these media don't bring in much money. And so the people who are journalists, they are looking at the entries of money, and the people who control the journalists are looking at the entries of money. And ultimately, they care more about giving you the information that the payers want to see, rather than giving you the information that you would need as a citizen.
That is true. Although I would add to that one of the themes for tonight is that we're going to think beyond just the advertisers. And I really want people to sort of adopt a broader network-wide conception of who the stakeholders in the media are, and really begin to see things more as sponsors than as advertisers. Because as we're going to go over, there is often a conflict of interest between the sponsors, that is, the people who own the media, and the advertisers, the people who make a particular media organization profit. So,
and, and the typical naive person looking at media will think, okay, the advertiser, like the car company, is paying for this newspaper. Therefore, this newspaper is biased when talking about cars. But if it was only that, it wouldn't be that dramatic, right?
Right. Well, what we'll see is that there's an enormous cast of characters here. There's the financial sponsor. There's soft dollars with favors. There's something that Tom Wolfe calls in The Bonfire of the Vanities, a concept of the favor bank. And then, a lot of favors for favors, soft dollars with NGOs and charitable nonprofits, as well as both sort of business and political favors. We're going to dive into all of that stuff. It's going to be it's going to be like, when you pull an old rug out and you see like all the dirt and bugs and this whole universe of life that looked like it was just below that's what we're going to pull off tonight.
All right, so take us through the structure of the media industry. Who owns it and how is it owned? Because owning is a complex word when you think about it. What is the structure of how these companies are embedded into one another?
All right, so I am going to answer that question, but I want to prep it with a little bit of history, because how the media is owned now is very different than how it's been historically owned. It was really not until about the last 40 years that we saw what is sort of the current conglomerated structure of mass media. It's gone through a bunch of evolutions, and I want people to kind of understand the history of American media before I dive into that. So can I jump into
Absolutely, go for it.
All right.
Now, I will just say someone on the regular chat named Franco B just said, JF, you're a fucking faggot. Well, fuck you, Franco B. And my mods, please ban this guy. I don't even want to touch him.
Franco, I'm not impressed by your performance, Franco. It's my George St. Pierre voice. I'm not. All right. So when we talk about mainstream media, I want people to really like get the concept here. We're talking about the intersections of culture, politics, and business. So we're going to begin our dive by talking about the business itself. So I used to practice private equity and hedge fund law. And the best way to understand mainstream media is through the analogy of private equity. I'd be curious how many people in the chat are familiar with private equity, but private equity is the most notorious business field and practice in high finance. It totally revolutionized the American business landscape in the 1980s. For those who've seen the movie Wall Street, Gordon Gekko was a private equity specialist. It's what top sharks like Carl Icahn specialize in. It's how Mitt Romney made his money. So the way PE works, and I'm going to tie this in a minute here, but the way private equity works is a sponsor sets up a new company, which is called a holding company, and then it buys a large existing company, and we're going to call that the operating company, which is then folded underneath this new shell so that the operating company keeps its same name, its same brand, and its core business activity, but its ownership has changed. So it's now not operating for the benefit of itself. It's operating for the benefit of its parent. Okay, so this has radical implications. So what happens is, in the course of this takeover by a sponsor, the assets and the business lines of the existing company will be reorganized and sliced and diced into a dozen or sometimes 20 different related affiliate companies. There are different companies called affiliates which spin off certain business lines or assets, often in a reorganization.
So for someone like me who doesn't understand all of these business structures, how does that compare to Shark Tank?
Okay, so Shark Tank is about providing venture capital. That is the initial seed, or sometimes it's Series A, Series B startup capital. So when you're a new company, Shark Tank, or a developing company, I should say, venture capital is very different from private equity, because venture capital is when a speculator bets that a new company is going to go to the absolute moon, right? So you get extremely rich if you bet right on venture capital, but 9 out of 10 bets fail. So in Shark Tank, they're presenting to Mark Cuban and to the others a idea that is either new or in its early stage development. What private equity does is it takes a mature company, which is often itself already a conglomerate, and then a hugely funded giant pool of money comes in under the leadership of a small management team, and it buys an enormous company, takes it private, and then slices and dices it. They got reputations in the 1980s as being like the new robber barons, essentially like vultures feeding on a corporate carcass. Because what would happen is they would buy a company and then they would just abuse the shit out of it so that the company didn't necessarily keep going. Because they could basically loot the company. They could make business decisions that were extremely bad in the long term, but extremely profitable in the short term, because it didn't matter to them if 100,000 people went out of work or if the factories closed or if relationships were destroyed. They weren't in it for the long term. And what it also did is it radically reorganized the concept of who owns a business, because you now had all of these businesses not operating for themselves. They're not driven by the normal profit motive. And we're going to see that in the media big time.
So these big companies, they buy companies a little bit like you would buy a broken car, where you want to get the pieces that work out of it. And if you buy a company that's in the media, I guess that your goal is to buy their customers, to buy their audience, but you don't necessarily care about the root of the reason why this particular media company was successful in the past. You just want to buy its output, or you want to buy a piece of it, and you buy the whole thing and you slice it, as you say.
Right. And more than that, it means that the operating company itself does not have to make money anymore, because it can be funded by the parent without, that is, I'll give you an example. We're going to go through a bunch of these, but the Washington Times is a great example of this. It's the conservative newspaper many of you will recognize, founded in 1982. it historically ran at annual losses of between $35 million to $100 million a year. But what it was the public relations front for the Ronald Reagan revolution and the pre-Rupert Murdoch neocon movement. And so it had a net value to the parent substantially higher. So it was able to, basically what I'm trying to tell you, JF, is that media, to think of media as business in the conglomerated landscape that we're in right now, with these huge sprawling companies that have many different business divisions that all interrelate in a large ecosystem, you don't need to do it for the money necessarily. Sometimes the political influence is more important. Sometimes the relations and access to wealth for particular individuals. You're not talking about an orange, like an orange stand or like a lemonade stand or something, where the value of the business is the sale of the product. There's so much else for sale in media, because media is the distribution of information. So it plays into so many other things. So you can't think of this strictly as business.
Wonderful. Well, worrying in many ways.
So actually, as a biologist, I want to run something by you. So you've read Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene, I presume?
Absolutely. My favorite book. Every time someone asks me to recommend books, it's The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins and The Extended Phenotype by Richard Dawkins.
I was just going to mention The Extended Phenotype, because there's an amazing analogy here to thinking about the current mainstream media and the extended phenotype. So with the arrival of the sort of private equity era, what happened was a lot of these media companies totally centralized, right? You went from having like 1,000 back in like the 1950s to having 6. It's down to 6 companies control 90% of American mainstream media. And what happened was these existing media outlets became zombified, in effect. They came to exist in large part to be sort of used as pawns by a distant and unrelated set of millionaires, billionaires, politicians, and business interests. And, basically, the extended phenotype was the idea that you don't really know if the behavior of an organism is because of its genotype or because of another genotype that is sort of exerting its influence on it, right? You can't tell if the behavior of a host is because it's the genes of the host that are making the host do it, or because of the genes of the parasite that are causing the host to do it. And so,
absolutely, and you brought a beautiful quote from Cora, which explains this principle of Richard Dawkins very well. It says, "Things get creepy when we realize that a gene can have an effect in someone else's body." In a late chapter of The Extended Phenotype, Richard Dawkins gives a tour of some of the weird parasites that are out there. There are parasites that cause their snail host to have thicker shells, parasites that cause their mouse host to be less afraid of cats, and parasites that cause their ant host to get bright red abdomens and to climb zombie-like up to the top of blades of grass and stick out their juicy abdomens and freeze. The parasite's effect on the host are of course influenced by genes inside the parasites. Through a chain of cause and effect, the genes inside the parasites have effects in the host. Those effects are part of the gene's phenotypes because they are outside the body, which we are most used to calling the phenotype. Richard Dawkins called this idea the extended phenotype. And social relations in human work on the same principles. If you are crying, and by your crying you are inducing an effect on someone else, you are essentially using their muscle power with your tears to get them to do something for you.
Right. Yep. So that's one of the things. I have a major pet peeve, JF, and that is I really hate when people take an overly narrow view of what something like CNN is or BuzzFeed is, because thinking of it as a tree rather than as a forest is going to lead you to take a very different strategy and cause very different adaptations in your theoretical knowledge of how the world works, but also as part of a movement where the people who enjoy this content, you have a sort of duty and obligation to make the world a better place using this knowledge. So I want to make sure that people think bigger. One of the main purposes of tonight is to disabuse you for once and for good of the notion that a mainstream media journalist can find a story and report it. Okay, they are not reporting it for you. They're not even necessarily reporting it for themselves. Because what I'm trying to say with this extended phenotype analogy is that they're really reporting it for their own sponsors, whether or not it is profitable. If it's profitable to the parent, it doesn't matter if CNN suffers. If it's profitable to the parent, it doesn't matter if NBC or ABC or any of the others we're going to go over suffers, because there's a whole dynamic here. There's a meta on top of it. So a lot of things that look like bad business decisions or why are they doing this are often explainable because of the level on top of it, which is what we're going to get into now. Well,
absolutely. That's very important. And it challenges a libertarian view for the state of media right now, because libertarianism and some form of capitalism relies on, you get to efficiency because of competition. But competition works if the accounts are being held positive through the input of a customer who's paying. When you think of the system that you drew for me there, this is not a system that is subject to the same type of competition. It's not competition for good information to the audience. It's competition to please billionaires who can then adjust the accounts so that even if your enterprise is losing money, there's an input of money coming from the top to save you all the times and to maintain you in that state of slavery to greater interest.
Right. So you can think of it like the concept of a proxy warrior, right? Like if a orange stand is not making money or making money, the orange stands aren't really a proxy warrior for, say, I don't know, like a Hispanic identity group to subvert like a Korean identity group, right? Like you don't really use orange stands for that, but you might want to control the use of the coverage and framing of information. So I think it's useful now to put this all in context, to do like a 5-minute overview of the history of mass media. So that's a little bit down in the show notes. When I sent this to you earlier, didn't put in exact order, but do you mind if I run over that for the audience
now? Go for it.
All right. So the story of mass media is the sequential conquest by marketing of information, first in public spaces through posters and billboards, then the family home by radio and TV, then person-to-person communication through computers and online portals, and now into like physical movement with mobile smartphones. And mass media started in 1833 is sort of what historians of the broadcast publishing industry sort of peg it at. And the story really begins with the newspaper wars in New York of the Jackson era, the Andrew Jackson era. The first merchant of attention, so to speak. And this is documented.
And that's a book, right, by Tim Wu?
Yes, it's a great book I recommend called The Attention Merchants by Tim Wu. So a lot of my sources that I'm citing here are from this book. I think he was the guy who invented the term net neutrality. He does kind of a number of things related to digital ads and in the digital space. Anyway, good book. So what happened was these newspaper wars were occurring, but they were soft wars because at the time, newspapers were a luxury. They were not in large, like the average everyday person did not and could not afford newspapers, and women by and large didn't read them. They were essentially statesman information outlets for people who were sort of upper class males. And what happened was Benjamin Day, he was a young guy, he was about 23, and he basically disrupted this entire market by inventing what he called the penny press. So whereas these daily publications typically cost 6 cents, he started underselling things for a penny. He decided basically that rather than making money through selling the information to you directly, that he would just basically give it to you for free and then charge the advertiser. So he invented the advertising space.
Wow.
Advertising and mass media are very interrelated concepts, so I'm going to refer to them fairly interchangeably here. So what happened was Benjamin Day totally took over. He slew everybody in the New York newspaper wars, and within 2 years of its founding, his newspaper, the New York Sun, became the most widely read newspaper in the world. And he did this basically through having this garish, lurid, outrageous content and selling it dirt cheap and then going to the advertisers. Now, what's really interesting for the history of mass media is you'll see these same themes going back like literally 200 years at this point. Day was very fast and loose with the truth. There was a famous episode in 1835 where he published a story about the moon that was totally fictional, about life on the moon, and everybody believed it. Everyone took it on faith because it was printed in the mass media, and everyone believed that there was this sensational life on the moon that was, and this was 1835. This was the original fake news, thing, but this was a regular occurrence.
Wow.
Another theme, though, is that when Benjamin Day arrived on the scene and took over and sort of started mass media, that is, media available to everybody, not just to the sort of rich upper class, he was followed by a long stream of people who were former preachers. A lot of people got into ads and media from religious backgrounds. And early stereotypes of 19th century mass media often drew on these stereotypes and tropes about religious propaganda and the idea that media and advertising culture is a religious practice. So
when you think about it, religions are a form of mass media, a kind of pre-consumerism mass media.
Yeah. I mean, I guess at a certain level, every idea is a meme that exists within the ecosystem of a religion. But I bring it up here because we're going to see religious conflict in the story of mass media that many who who think intellectually about relationships between Christians and Jews and Muslims, we're going to see this play out in the story of the media itself. And especially when you think about religion as a proxy for ethnicity, I find the fact that the birth of mass media was by preachers and sort of different religious people who are both Jewish and Christian. I find that to be a fascinating sort of foreboding intersection. But
now we're
anyway.
Before 1940s, so they cannot call them Nazis for no reason because Nazis didn't exist yet.
I don't know, JF, I don't know if that's enough to stop them. I think that I'm pretty sure somebody mass hallucinated a time machine in their sleep one night and came up with the concept of Nazi, if not the direct word for it, eons before it actually existed.
All right. So
all right, anyway.
we're still in the 1830s.
We're going to fast forward now. Okay. So with Day, news became available to the entire world, right? So now you have the mass element of media, but it's not yet been industrialized. The industrialization of mass media happened with World War I, and it happened with war propaganda. So what happened was in 1914, during World War I, Germany could mobilize about 4.5 million men, and Britain was desperate. They could only get about 700,000 men to join the war organically. So to build a bigger army, the British government embarked on the first systematic propaganda campaign in history, the first systematic information propaganda campaign. And it printed 50 million large, colorful recruitment posters and plastered them everywhere on shops, houses, buses, trams. It staged rallies and parades. It had all of these. This was the first time that this had been done in this sort of mass and emotionally laden way. And it worked. Basically, millions of Britons were energized by this campaign and arguably marched off to gruesome, pointless deaths in a gruesome, pointless war stirred up purely by mass media propaganda. So
It's stunning because I think of statements heard a week ago on CNN, and the fact that the first attempts at making mass media was to send people to war, and I hear 1 week ago at CNN a full approval of the Trump strikes in Syria and that kind of stuff. It's stunning how things haven't changed since 100 years.
yeah, well, if anything, they've been ever more refined and scaled on, right? I mean, you have two very early influences here: religion and preaching combined with mobilization for war. So, interesting sense of foreshadowing here.
Yeah.
But basically, before 1914, three things that everyone knows about today were totally non existent, these as concepts. The first was demand engineering, which is basically a fancy term for creating a desire for news, products, or services that is artificially tinkering with the human mind's desire for something through the use of mass media. Before it was sort of, here are my wares, do you like them or not?
Yeah.
Two was the concept of branding and building brand loyalty, which is a concept we're going to get into with identity politics, about the war for winning brand loyalty from different groups, and how identity politics factors on in mass media very early on. And the third was targeted advertising, which is what we now know as the sort of bread and butter, the tip of the spear of marketing theory. And how this came about in 1914, well, I guess in sort of the late 19 teens and early 1920s, was originally through focusing on the female customer who did most household purchasing. This was the first instance of targeted advertising. I bring this up because it's instructive that identity politics was the birthplace of targeted mass media advertising. This idea that you could splice and dice the population into different identity groups and then selectively target them through mass media. So splitting apart, rather than selling the good, you're now parsing everything into an identity group and hyper-targeting each one with your messaging.
Yeah, because presumably a certain political message that could be good in a part of the population might actually be useless or even worse, wrong for your political goal if you send it to another part of the population.
Right. Well, and I think there's a trade-off here between effectiveness and ethics. And this is something, a running theme here. But one of the reasons that this was not done before is because there was sort of a Christian ethos about merchantry and sales to be less ostentatious, to kind of present your wares as they are, to not undersell your adversaries, and not to sort of parse things too finely, to sort of maximize autonomy of the customer. That was sort of the honorable way to win. And with the Benjamin Day school of mass media, it turned out that it's like competing with somebody on steroids and you're clean. Like, you will have the pride of knowing that you fought ethically, but you're going to get your ass kicked. So anyway, that takes us into the radio era, and I'm going to wrap this up quickly here. But I want people to know the history and know that this is not new. So basically, in 1928, Amos and Andy aired, and it was a show that at its peak drew about 40 to 50 million nightly listeners, with a national population of only about 120 million. Okay, so that's like basically having the Super Bowl on every single night. And it only had one advertiser. This is NBC, which aired Amos and Andy, this toothpaste company called Pepsodent, which was later, the show was later canceled in 1953 following protests by the NAACP. So what was very interesting about this is that from the beginning, organized, weaponized identity politics, particularly POC identity politics, black anger and sort of non-white mobilized anger, was the primary pressure tactic to control and influence mass media broadcasters, that is, to pressure them.
So what was the protest against this program by NAACP, and what is NAACP?
The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is interesting to say that phrase out loud now, because the phrase colored people is considered to be verboten, on par with the N-word, basically. But the NAACP was pretty much the first organized Black identitarian, organized political and cultural group. So if my memory serves me well, it was formed in like the 1920s or 30s, but essentially it was instrumental in the rise of in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. It has a very interesting history of being arguably run by Jewish people rather than Black people, with sort of using this Black cause as a sort of proxy warrior for cultural dominance. That is a popular theory of the NAACP, and I have to confess.
Not in 1953. We're in 1953, and we got SJWs shutting it down.
Oh, JF. Well, what do you think? Remember, Henry Ford was like in the 1920s. Lindbergh was in the 1940s. This story of SJWism did not begin in the 1960s. It began at least 50 years before that. And it took 50 years to really get complete cultural dominance. The birth, a lot of people sort of put 1913 kind of as the pivotal year. There were a lot of things that happened there with sort of the initial groundwork for identity politics that came to fruition in 1964 with the civil rights legislation that we've never looked back from. But essentially, the 1910s to the 1960s were the culture war. And once the culture war was won in that time span, the 1960s solidified and they codified essentially that cultural dominance into law and into business. Mm-hmm. So we codified everything from affirmative action, disparate impact, to minority business loans, to ethnic identity politics for everyone but Europeans. It made the diversity industry grow into this absolutely juggernaut force that has now wrapped itself into every educational and business entity. But anyway, bit of digression. I just want people to understand that when we see these pressure tactics like, oh, let's get Glenn Beck canceled, or let's get Roseanne canceled because she said something involving, an animal that dehumanized a person of color, right? This is not a new phenomenon. We're talking 1953. A company with a show that had just one advertiser basically you had a lot of very smart, economically tactical Jewish tacticians in the sort of Black identity movement that were able to exert this early influence on mass media. And after securing cultural victories like that, it became unchallengeable, right? We're living in the aftermath of all of this, the battles that were already lost a long time ago. Anyway, so, and that takes us, we'll skip now ahead to the modern era. So after the beginning and around like the 1980s and 90s, there was a mass consolidation of all of these different mass media outlets, which all tried their hand at being, the number one, the king of the hill. And then with the advent of the sort of private equity era, with the and with all the changes in the business landscape involving, scaling of these sort of sprawling conglomerates, and we're going to talk about what each one of those are shortly. Then you had this supersizing of media companies to where you no longer have NBC. NBC is just they are an outlet in a large ecosystem of a much bigger beast. So a classic example, we're going to go into what the big six are now. But a classic one is Disney, for example. Should we pull this up on screen? Actually, I think it's very useful for people to see this with their own eyes. If you So I have links that I included in the show notes. I'm trying to find my lobby button. Do you need to pause for super chats or anything?
Is it the Times of Israel article?
I just put it in the lobby.
Okay.
But this is just a Google search picture of the image that I downloaded for you.
Okay, so that's a picture of the ecosystem.
Right. So where we are now is these media behemoths. We're at 6 companies now. Remember, I used the analogy of a parent, right? And you exist for something else. Like right now, take ABC, okay? Let's just talk about Disney. Disney owns the following, right? They own ABC, they own ESPN, they own Walt Disney, they own Pixar, they own Marvel, they own Star Wars, they own Lucasfilms, right? So a bunch of these are like ABC is one of the largest mainstream media outlets. ESPN is the largest news outlet in sports, right? So, but these ABC and ESPN exist to maximize the total shareholder value of Disney. Okay, I assume they file joint tax returns. They're basically, although I'll have to double check that, but they exist to serve Disney as the master, right? So if ABC publishes something, the buck stops at Disney. Same thing with, for example, CNN, right? So Time Warner owns HBO, CNN, Cartoon Network, TNT, TBS, DC, Warner Brothers, a bunch of others. National Amusements, owned by Sumner Redstone and the Redstone family, owns CBS, Viacom, BET, MTV, Nickelodeon. These are all reporting up to the Redstones, to the sort of Redstone ecosystem. And I think it's important that people don't necessarily point the finger at CNN. It's, they are the messenger of a much larger set of sponsors. So I can talk about the ownership of who these 6 are, or we can sort of transition into sort of, tactics here.
You decide what's best.
Okay. So, I am going to just go into, since this is sort of the deep dive, pulling the rug out. I think I'm going to talk about each one of these 6 companies, who owns them, and some interesting ethnic politics. This is not a show centered on like Jewish issues. As a Jewish person with my particular beliefs, I'm sort of an amateur historian of these kinds of things. So I think they're fun to talk about rather than, divisive, because, to me, it's just, oh, that's interesting and will help me to make better predictions, not because of any sort of hate in my heart or whatever. But anyway, so the combined value of these big 6 companies is $430 billion. Okay, that's a lot of matzah. It's $430 billion for 6 companies. And we're going to go through all of them in turn. There's sort of running theme, I guess, where people talk about Jewish ownership of modern media and how it was not necessarily always that way. Like Hollywood was sort of always that way, but what we now know is the mass media of, broadcast news and print and things like that. It's really sort of the past 30, 40 years that this became hypercharged. So I put a bunch of links here that are interesting to go over here, but I'll start with National Amusements, which is the sort of umbrella company that owns CBS, Viacom, BET, MTV, all those. So that's owned by Sumner Redstone, a very, very powerful and influential pro-Israel Zionist. You have Comcast. Oh, by the way, there's another image here that's useful so people can see the exact revenues of each of these that I included. But Brian Roberts, who is the head of Comcast, is another sort of Jewish outsized Zionist promoter, and all the people that I'm going to name here that are the heads of these big six, all except one essentially, have been totally showered with awards from Jewish identity groups, which is just so interesting to me because it's not like the Irish Heritage Foundation is doing the same thing with each of them. And when you look at their connections, it's really fascinating. So we can go through specific articles that I pulled. But so that's Sumner Redstone is the head of National Amusements. That's one of the big six. Brian Roberts, the head of Comcast. That's another one of the big six. Bob Iger, who's the head of Disney. It's another one of the big six. Bob Iger is, often, referred to as the most influential man in Hollywood because of his taking over of Disney. But since Disney is now a news corporation as much as Hollywood, they're really a media mogul more than a Hollywood mogul now. He is, extremely pro-Zionist. His family's investment trust is based in Israel. A lot of their biographies are rife with references to families escaping the Holocaust and sort of identity around the sort of Jewish, the sort of Jewish survival narrative that that at any minute anti-Semitism could reemerge, and so we need to be proactively offensive at the slightest drop of a hat to and what looks like defense starts to manifest itself as like smothering offense because of how vigilant you are about anti-Semitism. And then once you sort of own things because no one can challenge you, like abuses of that. So,
and it's very interesting to see the progression of Disney into promoting literally movies that are about leftism and even feminism. When Disney started doing Pixar movies, they got more and more moral, and they got more and more pushing a leftist ideology within the last 15 years.
Well, it's crazy with Disney because Walt Disney was extremely J-woke, if you will. He was. If you look at the early Disney movies, things like Dumbo, where you had this, totally, just totally like what we would consider by today's standards, really over the top scenes, both in, Dumbo and Pinocchio. I'm not even sure that those films could be shown today. I'm curious if their distribution has been limited, like Huckleberry Finn was and other things, because of the really, all the black people in those movies had extremely big lips and talk jive. There were Walt Disney in the 1940s and 50s, it is completely unrecognizable from the sort of Frozen and whatever the latest, oh my God, the latest atrocity that I saw was Zootopia.
I didn't see this one.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Another night, I think it's very instructive because Zootopia is like the ultimate movie that I think that like expresses the modern zeitgeist of like multiculturalism. But anyway, that's what they traffic in now.
Okay.
So a lot of people point to so the next mogul. So we're 3 out of 3 right now are very ethnocentric Zionist Jews. So I'm going to pause to say this, to say that me personally, the issue is with weaponized identity politics. And what bothers me isn't necessarily the pattern of, they just so happen to be Jewish. It's that there is a really crazy intersection between these groups and funding, awards, both domestic funding from Jewish groups, pressure that is applied at critical moments, and then a lot of like foreign influence with the state of Israel itself. So like a good example of that is Rupert Murdoch. So a lot of people point to Rupert Murdoch as like the example that Jewish people don't have disproportionate overrepresentation of major mass media ownership. So, are you ready for the Rupert Murdoch tell-all, or do you need to
I
read
want to
super
know
chats?
everything about Rupert Murdoch. But yeah, let's read some super chats before. We have a good news from Secret Genius. He says, "Chin up, everyone. I was at Sargon's even yesterday and mentioned Frame Games Radio during a Q&A while asking a spicy question. Later, a Jewish person approached me and mentioned how Frame Games Radio red pill him. This has impact." It's great that he saw impact of Frame Game in the real world thanks to Sargon's comedic tour.
JF,
What?
I love you, man, but I think you just killed my Twitter account.
How did I kill your Twitter account?
Well, because the one thing that like the BuzzFeed intern watching this video right now is scouting for is like whether or not I'm effective. Like, but
All
hey,
right.
BuzzFeed, love you guys. Look, you need us. All right. You it's like that scene from Scarface. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say that's the bad guy.
And
So
I saw
keep me
that in your
alive.
note you had studied the viral impact, the impact of this new viral economy where there's lots of clickbait and stuff. Did I ever tell you, Frame Game, that I was once a writer of titles for viral outlets?
No way.
Oh yeah.
Tell me more. I'm
Well,
curious.
I can demonstrate my talent to you. Give me a fact.
The moon is bright.
Okay, the moon is bright. Let me think about it. One scientist took a picture of the moon, and you won't believe what's on it.
Holy fuck.
Would you click on that?
Holy fuck. Is this like really formulaic and like
Absolutely.
based on...
I got trained. There were people doing that before I came in, and they trained me into how to write these titles. There's really formulas. And there's even stuff that's viral, but it's like it's two years ago that they moved on to some other viral stuff. And so sometimes I was writing in old style, and they were like, "No, that's too old. We want you to go more aggressive."
Oh my god, I love that, dude. This is why we work so well together. You're like a framing master, and it's awesome. Like can I tell a little bit of like inside baseball about like our Twitter conversations about titles?
Yeah,
because like I have this habit of I'm very conservative about like the current state of things, and like you come up with these like very intriguing titles that are always like 2 points past my comfort zone, and I need to like before every video JF and I do, it's like, JF man, listen please, I want to like can we just not make this so effective with the title name, because I don't want it to draw people in the way that it, and you've talked me off the ledge every time on that, so it's interesting.
Yeah. Like the example was like what behind the curtain. You felt that saying that it was a curtain was kind of, you felt that it would be overselling the thing, but I explained in the episode and to you in private that to me there's a curtain, there's a veil in front of this information, and we're revealing it.
Yeah, well, I think that's an example of my only small victory so far, Jeff, because your initial title was Behind the Veil, I think.
Yeah.
And you and I wanted something completely different, but you were like, we're going to settle at curtain. I was like, all right.
All right, Charlene says, "Evening, Jeff. May unite me with a wrench so I can do my part to protect Western chat. I did. Keep this chat clean." Our Jazz says, "Second super chat for the day because I'm drunk." Frederick White says, "As a working class white Catholic, I am shocked by the amount of Catholic hatred in the dissident right movement. Catholics need a separate movement." Maybe they do. I mean, I'm not going to be the guy for this because I'm an atheist, but I'm an atheist born in the Catholic tradition, and who has inherited a lot of Catholic values. Fernando Covet says US media conglomerates are worth half of Apple. SJ 20 bucks says, in my opinion, we need more normal, likable people out front trying to stop our replacement. We need to walk in love, not be afraid to embrace, have friends of other ethnicities, but be clear about maintaining our majorities. Thoughts? Well, I think that that's a great statement. I think, personally, my involvement in the right is not in the rejection of minorities, and I totally agree with your statement.
Yeah, can I chime in on two of these real quick? So in reverse order, yeah, well, I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Like I did a video called "The Fist Inside the Velvet Glove," and there I talk about having a 2-track parallel system. One which is the hard right, that is the rigid, unflinching, morally principled and backboned version, and then the heart right, which is sort of the big tent white identity politics. Like I did a stream like 2 nights ago, and a guy who was an African American called in and said he was a fan he regularly watched, and what could he do as an ally as a black person? Like there's a lot of these people who call in, and like you need both, in my opinion, and they don't necessarily need to touch each other, but having these parallel tracks, that's what happened in the 1950s and 60s. You had like the Panthers and the identitarians, but you also had the hippies and the artists and the musicians, and you need both. I don't think one or the other does it. It's not dynamic enough. And then the second point was about Catholics. There's a great book called The Slaughter of Cities by E. Michael Jones, and he describes what happened to the white cities of America during the 1940s and 50s, and how the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant power elite basically turned to a lot of Jewish power structures and influence to try to break up Catholic solidarity, and because Catholics were presenting sort of a rise to the WASP power structure, and he documents in lurid detail how sort of WASPs and elite Jews sort of did a little bit of a tag team to disperse Catholics into the cities and replace them with ethnic minorities. Very interesting theory that he has. I encourage you to check it out.
All right. A Fistful of Shekels says, FG, what do we do about... I will not read this one. Rila says, ultimately, we need to build an ultimatum of builds. I don't know what that means. Mac Isaac says, keep it up, JF. An episode with Frame and Patrick Little would be awesome. What are your views on Patrick Little?
I'm going to like just kind of withhold comment on that until I sort of understand more about, I haven't been following it all that much. I kind of want to see how it develops. And I also think that my place in all of this is not to weigh in on things like this. I want to respect the question, but you guys are going to call me subversive if I say some shit one way or the other, and I'd rather just kind of stay out.
It must be a terrible position to be in your position where no matter what you say, there's people in the movement calling you subversive.
Yeah, well, it's funny, but I actually think on net it's a lot easier for me. I mean, I have days where I'm just like, I'm so battle hardened at this point, and there's still days where the weight of it all is so heavy, and I think to myself sometimes like, what if like it was, I didn't have the Jewish thing? What if it was truly like my people that this was happening? And I just think it's a lot easier for me to deal with the weight of this sometimes because of my position in this. So I know it's like don't, I don't need any sympathy. I think on net it's a lot easier for me.
And to people who do that kind of critique, I say, judge people by their action. That is the essence of autism, as it turns out, because I've actually studied experiments that were done on autistic people, and it turns out that they have a tendency to judge on action rather than intention. And I would say in that case, it's a very good evaluation to give to people the credit for their actions rather than perceived intentions, because when you dive into intention perceptions, you can invent stuff and you can become paranoid to forces that are actually good for you. When you care about the facts of the public space, it's all there. They're either true or they're false, and you care about what their effect is. That's the way I approach reality. Finally, before we continue, Undisclosed says, honestly, I wouldn't care if Jews had so much power. If Jews would just stop abusing that power for their own benefit and behave like normal people. I think
Okay.
that... Go, what?
No, I'll go second. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, go ahead. I
Okay,
was just about to say that yes, if there was no cases of abuse of media power and cases of politics, of involvement in state politics, I think it wouldn't be that much a problem if that there are Jewish billionaires. And I've always said the final cure is simply to get rid of the state as much as possible. As long as the state is there to be subverted, you're leaving a tool to billionaires to control your lives. In a libertarian order, there would be much less power to the state, and therefore subverting the state would be less interesting to people.
Yeah, well, I think that super chat like perfectly encapsulates my view on this. Like, I think my beef with it isn't with Jewish people, obviously. It's with the abuse of identity politics and what it's doing to the country, and ultimately what it will do to the environment I want for my grandkids. Like, I don't think Jewish like subversion is the reason that Jews are 50% of like historical world chess champions, right? Like, but the problem is like when the World Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Congress and B'nai B'rith and the ADL and the Simon Wiesenthal Center all, team up on David Irving to say that he's a Nazi and should be thrown in jail for years because he says that, he has a different take on things. It conflicts with my principles of reason and science. Like, it was this tension between my American values and frankly, my autism and my, like, it offends my autism so much that I need to like make these constant carve outs for reason and meritocracy and science and advancement. And then, on the episodes that you and I did earlier, where we talked about the impact of demographics and then what's to come based on like a dozen places this has happened historically, like, fucking hell, man. Like, if you guys haven't watched that in the chat, you need to watch those two starter videos.
What's to come, Behind the Curtain, and the first one, how did we title it?
You remember.
You will remember because you were emotionally triggered.
Dude, I was like, I couldn't sleep the night before. I was like, he's going to name it The End of White Civilization.
The End of White Civilization, that's it. So we found what was the inner workings of Frame Game. Is autism is just higher than is Judaism. That's why he's here talking about alt-right subjects.
Yeah, there's like a stone on each side of the scale, and like it just has this, there is this tension.
All right, so we were talking about major people in the media industry. We've gone through Rupert Murdoch, Bob Iger, Sumner Redstone. Are there other big names?
Oh, yes. So far we've covered half of the big six: Sumner Redstone, Brian Roberts, and Bob Iger. I should note this is a very timely topic, given that Elon Musk is now under intense fire by predominantly Jewish press for saying, who do you think owns the media? Which he was clearly referring to like millionaires and billionaires, because it's private. He was trying to make the point that like the press is not like this disinterested, like independent organ, but rather he's espousing my view that it's the public relations office of its sponsors.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's not news. It's public relations of its sponsors. You shouldn't even think of it like news in your head. You should just, every time you see an article, it's like, well, what does this public relations outlet say?
Yeah.
Like, just contextualize it that way. But anyway, so he's under enormous fire right now for saying who owns the media. So I think that this section is especially topical. So now we're going to move on to number 4, and we come to our first potentially not Jewish person who owns the mass media, so to speak. And that is the super mogul Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox. He owns the Wall Street Journal. He owns a whole network of media. I pulled up an article that should I throw that on the screen? I want to throw a few of these on the screen so that people can.
I have it here. Murdoch is Daddy Warbucks to the neocons.
Yes. Do you want to do screen share? Or you want me to run that?
I have it. I'm showing it right now.
Okay, cool. So a lot of people just think of Fox News when they think Rupert Murdoch, and they have no idea of the past 50 years of history and how we got here. Everyone thinks of Rupert Murdoch as like just the Fox guy. He's the guy who owns Fox and he gives Republicans good media press. He has funneled hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into the conservative ecosystem, especially conservative media, but many other conservative causes. And in that article, I'm just going to read some quotes. This is the AmericanConservative.com. It says what Murdoch's fortunes have done is allow a hegemonic persuasion, neoconservatism, to gain undue influence on the American right, including the Republican Party. In the 1980s, the conservative movement, whatever its deficiencies, exhibited a wide range of views on social and historical questions. Many of the views that are now identified with the alt-right, or the alternative or disaligned right, were then expressed in National Review, which we now know is to be Supercucked with David French and Jonah Goldberg or whatever, and in other widely read and once interesting publications that have since come under neoconservative control. Now, here's what a lot of people don't understand, and you need to sort of know where we are. The major funder of right-wing media and of the GOP from the 1970s through 1980s, that is in the post-Goldwater defeat of 1964, a lot of it was this guy named Reverend Moon. I'm curious how many people in the chat have heard of Reverend Moon, because it's one of the most interesting stories in political mass media.
I have no idea what that is.
Oh, man. Okay, well, buckle up, because this is going to blow your effing mind, man. Reverend Moon was the Rupert Murdoch before Rupert Murdoch beheaded him. Okay, Reverend Moon was basically responsible in large part for the Bushes coming to power. He was the darling of the Ronald Reagan era. Ronald Reagan talked effusively about Reverend Moon. Reverend Moon is probably one of the most interesting men in the world, if not the most interesting. Okay, he was a Korean guy he was born poor. He had 10 kids. He went on to become the head. He went on to found and become the head of a multinational billion-dollar conglomeration, which mixed sort of official businesses with dirty, corrupt, and sometimes violent businesses. There's a sheet showing 60 pages of different entities that he owned. He was worth billions of dollars. He single-handedly infused the GOP of the 1970s and 80s with $2 billion. That's one person, right? Now, just to put that in context, Hillary Clinton's entire campaign spend according to Open Secrets, the public watchdog for all that, was $1.3 billion for this election. So one man single-handedly paid for 1.5 times the entire Hillary Clinton behemoth, which was the most expensive campaign in history. So that goes to show you the impact of this one guy with 10 kids. Not only did he start this international business, JF, he started his own religion that he called the World Unification Church. And
what the fuck? What was his motivations?
We're going to get to that. I'm going to pull up these articles for you, because you need to see it for yourself. And this gets us into the intersections between race, between religion, and between the conflict between right-wing, left-wing, and identitarian politics. You're going to flip your shit when you hear the history, the rise and fall and semi-re-rise of Reverend Moon. So I'm going to put this in the lobby
for now, he seems quite independent. He's an Asian with 10 babies, billionaire, and he makes his own church.
Okay, so
I trust this guy.
I'm going to read some quotes for you, okay? One of the most, this is from the LA Times in 1997. One of the most questionable relationships in the GOP are the controversies about mysterious Asian political money. That is the GOP's long and lucrative relationship with the Reverend Moon and his Korea-based Unification Church. Over the past quarter century, the 77-year-old Moon has given the U.S. conservative movement sums estimated in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollars. I've seen estimates about $2 billion, so I'm going to settle on that. Most notably, Moon's deep pockets have financed the Washington Times, which gets us to the mass media architecture he set up, a leading conservative voice and one of the capital's 2 daily newspapers. But he has also invested heavily in building the right's political infrastructure, from direct mail outlets to video production houses to think tanks to academic centers. Remember, this is all a Korean religious cult leader billionaire. And now it's going to get fucking crazy in a minute here, but I'm high energy today.
I still trust him up to now.
Okay, all right. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Well, okay. So much of Moon's influence buying is done in secret and often occurs when conservatives are vulnerable to being bought. A recent example is Christian right-wing leader Jerry Falwell, whose fundamentalist Liberty University was slipping into bankruptcy. Falwell flew to Korea basically and got like $3.5 million in funding, basically on a promise loan from Moon. And he did this stuff regularly with people. And he would often, to escape campaign finance regulations, he's alleged to have his church members smuggle in millions of dollars in duffel bags as they flew to America from Korea for religious ceremonies. But remember, all of this is under the cloak of a lot of people say he started his religion to get political control. It's interesting that that's basically the same thing a lot of people, and I think some, at least partially correctly, allege about the sort of Jewish religious cloak and political power funneled in through religion, and also with a lot of the Catholic, Christian conservatives. But anyway, so Ronald Reagan called the Washington Times, which is Moon's operation, his favorite newspaper. President Bush basically said that he reads the Washington Times every day. And the Washington Times was losing about $35 to $100 million a year. So again, when you read the Washington Times, don't think of it like a business as you would an orange shop. It is the extended phenotype of Reverend Moon, right? It's losing money every single year, but what it's doing is it's buying favors and it's supporting politics. And so it's basically, it is the proxy warrior rather than a business. It plays a part in the meta war. So anyway, so get this, all right. Moon was one of the most vigilantly anti-communist people in the sort of post-World War II era. He formed a number of violent gangs, essentially, that recruited, at least to hear the mainstream media tell it nowadays, that recruited neo-Nazis from across the world as a sort of fascist calling card. People from Nazis who had fled from South America. He basically formed a small army in South America after assembling them, financing them. And here's a great article I'll pull up here. Let's see. He was what you would call Holocaust denier. I'm going to first I'll pull up the Wikipedia. Remember, this is the head fundraiser of the GOP. Can you put this guy on the screen? This is the Wikipedia for Moon's Unification Church and Judaism. So basically, much of the Christian religious doctrine had become totally cucked after the Vatican II Council in 1965, which is when a lot of the core teachings of Christianity were permanently reinterpreted to make Jewish people not responsible for the killing of Christ, to make it so that Jewish people should not be sought after for conversion. It was basically a Talmudic reinterpretation of the Bible to get the hundreds of millions of Catholics to see to be scrubbed of any kind of anti-Semitic sentiment. So Reverend Moon had none of that. Okay, he did not give a fuck. So basically, he got in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the American Jewish Committee in the 1970s. in 1975, the AJC released a report accusing the Unification Church of having over 125 instances of quote pejorative language, stereotyped imagery, and accusations of collective sin and guilt about Jews. Moon then countered and wrote a reply. They called on Moon's. They said that he was being anti-Semitic and that it was anti-Christian of him to even say these things about the Jews, and called upon him to make a comprehensive and systematic removal of all anti-Semitic references from their Bible. Okay, this is basically what they did to Catholics successfully in 1965. So here is how this Korean ZFG, master of the universe, replied. He issued a rebuttal to the report, stating that that the report itself had a hateful tone.
Essentially, this guy wanted Christianity with a little plus. Let's call it Christianity plus.
Sure, Christianity plus. So what ended up happening was Moon was forced out of power, basically, by the way, he started a number of anti-communist leagues that he referred to as Latin American death squads. It's just really weird looking at this now when you see some of the sort of extremist memery that emerged. Anyway, what happened was Moon was thrown in jail in 1984 for issues related to sort of corruption and tax issues, and that's when Rupert Murdoch basically stepped on the scene and became the chief financier of the right-wing mass media empire. But what ended up happening when Reverend Moon came back on the scene, because he was still financing things, is he did a total about face on America, and he said that that America. I'm going to try to pull up some direct quotes here, but he basically pulled like a George Lincoln Rockwell, General Patton, Charles Lindbergh. Like later in life, he came to recant his obsessively pro-America stance, because he was a Korean guy who said that America was the greatest country on earth, that all he wanted to do was promote America. And then in the 90s, when he saw the direction that neocons were taking the Republican Party in, he said that America is lost. It has become Satan itself. Because Americans and the neoconservatives are obsessive. They're obsessed with individuality, and this extreme individuality will get them killed in the long run. It's very interesting to see that in light of some of the collectivist inflections that have come back into the sort of nationalist meta. And then he said, he said that women have to learn to negate themselves and become more sexually traditional. And then he said that because of this overt obsession with individuality, that America had become so satanic that hamburgers should be considered evil because they come from America. But this is basically a guy who called communism a godless ideology. He did not mince words. And when he was dethroned from being the chief financier of the GOP, Rupert Murdoch took the GOP's direction in a totally sort of right-wing Zionist direction. Whereas Moon was chaotic and unstable, there was heterogeneity of beliefs in the right wing at that point.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Essentially, this guy pulled the right wing of America against converging toward the state that it has now converged to, which is a form of Zionist right wing, but he was pulling it in another direction.
Right. But what's interesting is he wasn't a racialist, so to speak. He was an America First guy who, while a lot of what he said certainly sort of verged on some of those tones, he was pretty much just obsessively anti-communist and traditionalist, what a lot of people might call sort of honorary, with this sort of I've been streaming lately with a friend of mine, Kai Chang, who's a Chinese guy who feels the same way that I do as a Jewish person, and I've seen this sort of archetype a number of times where you have people who are allies. This is one of the things about sort of a big tent ideology is, at least you get the benefit of the financial support, of the resources. And by and large, for all of his flaws, of which Moon had many, he was not dictatorial about right-wing media direction. That is, he didn't engage in the self-censorship, deplatforming, only one philosophy allowed philosophy that characterized the Murdoch era. He did his own thing, but other publications were allowed to flourish.
All right.
So with that all said, Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is commonly cited as like the exception to sort of the Jewish-owned press. His own heritage is sort of subject to a lot of speculation. But according to a Huffington Post article that I put in the notes here, there's a great quote that says, one would be hard-pressed to find a non-Jew who has been more honored by Jewish organizations than Rupert Murdoch. In 2006, he was awarded the Simon Wiesenthal's Humanitarian Laureate Award. In 2009, the American Jewish Committee awarded him Man of the Year. He opened his acceptance speech by saying, over the years, some of my wildest critics seem to have assumed I'm Jewish. At the same time, some of my closest friends wish I were. So tonight, let me set the record straight. I live in New York. I have a wife who craves Chinese food, and people I trust tell me I practically invented the word chutzpah. He works with the ADL and a number of other, the AJC and a number of these other Jewish identity organizations. His son, James Murdoch, for example, pledged $1 million as like a throwaway donation to the ADL after Charlottesville, when Trump said that there are two sides to it. James Murdoch came out and said, that's Trump being racist and enabling hatred and anti-Semitism. So Murdoch is also a very close friend of Ariel Sharon, who was the longtime prime minister of Israel. They were friends for, I think decades, at least since the I guess decades. And he's publicly said that from its beginning, his company News Corp has always been supportive of Jewish nationalist causes. He's always believed in the goals of the international Jewish community, and he basically is a big participator in these fundraisers for Jewish heritage museums, for Holocaust museums. But what you see is, if not Jewish themselves, there is this sort of phalanx of at least Zionist support that is totally unflinching.
Yeah.
Like whatever. Yeah. So it's interesting to see this. Maybe I don't want to make this too much about ethnic identity politics. So maybe we can move on from this. How are you feeling right now with the?
Yeah, let's keep going. So we don't know if his mother was Jewish, right?
Yeah, there's some uncertainty about that. But I'm happy to assume that this is basically a Christians United for Israel situation, where you have somebody who is heavily supported and sort of favors for favors, network with these Zionist groups, which is what explains there's no two sides that's even possible to be entertained, right? Like, to do so would be you can imagine what would happen, how much that would split Murdoch's network if he actually said something like that. There was an instructive example of this in this link, where Murdoch got in a lot of trouble in, I think 2012, because he made a tweet. I just posted it in the lobby, where he referred to the Jewish-owned press. And he did this in the context of the Jewish-owned press not being supportive enough of Israel. And here is I just put in the lobby the archive link to CNN's report on it by Howard Kurtz, saying Murdoch's shameful slam of Jewish-owned press. And this is, everybody in the media came after him for this, and he had to apologize for it. But what he was saying is, all he did is he did a tweet that said, why is Jewish-owned press so consistently anti-Israel in every crisis? So what he's trying to say is, I'm pro-Israel. Jewish, why is it that me, as somebody who is an ally to Jews but not Jewish myself, has to tell Jews to be even more ethnocentric with their stance, their public relations articles on Israel? But because he used this catchphrase, Jewish-owned press, that set an absolute firestorm over mainstream media, calling on him to retract it, to apologize, to issue a letter. And so even when he compliments, if he doesn't do it effusively enough, then you see this reaction. So
we've seen that kind of reinforcement in groups that we've talked in previous episode of intra-Jewish community pressures, and we've talked about it to Kevin McDonald too. That essentially, when a group has ethnocentric interest, it will also pressure the members of its group, and sometimes the members of its group are the first victims, if you will, of the violent pressure of extremists in the group who want to further the interest of the group.
Right. Okay, so let's transition now. That's a little bit on ownership and identity politics and the history of identity politics and the relationship with religion and these other things at stake in the business of media, right? It's not all just like the dollars of the media, like of CNN itself, right? You have all these other stakeholders. So to show an example of the relationship between media, cultural influence, business, and politics, I want to take everyone on a tour of the January 2017 leaked David Brock Media Matters Share Blue memo, perhaps one of the most instructive memos to digest that I've ever read. Do you need to pause for another round of super chats, or should I dive right in?
I think, since this is a very interesting part, let's get rid of some super chat and then let's talk about that part, because this is fascinating. Seeing the strategy that happens behind media outlets, it's absolutely shocking. So we have Mac Isaac. This one I read. We have Tactical Boomerism, who says the difference between the 60s and now is that Jews already own the media, politicians to push change policies before the Cultural Revolution even happened. First name, last name says, alt-right. Face it, you're too basic. Like the part of the mind that appreciates culture. I don't know what this guy means. I think he's a troll, so I will not read the rest. Robert Crawford says, I have a hypothesis that all ethnicities have a soul, and they will try to reproduce... all the ethnicities have a soul, and they will try to reproduce itself within others via culture. My question is, Frame Game, do you think the guilt pushed in Goyim is from the memes of the Jewish community? Well, I will say on this, essentially your theory is a mimetic theory of cultural transmission. And I don't know, Frame Games, if you have anything to say about the guilt aspect. I think it's a weird way to look at the world to call it this soul. What you're talking about is the transmission of cultural information, passes from brain to brain. And yes, people manipulate each other in all sorts of social situations.
Yeah, well, I do think it is part mimetic and part genetic. I certainly think that genes play some role. I would not deny that. I think the main role of genetics in that, though, is the baseline to which people revert in the absence of mimetics, and that the farther out your genetics are, the more radical, extreme, quick, and severe the mean reversion will be. So the ever more sort of authoritarian propaganda you need to get somebody, and I really the more environment you need to get people of different levels of sort of genetic, static equilibrium revert to. So I do think that there is a genetic aspect to it.
Fernando Covet says, Mark Penn and Steve Ballmer funded the Stagwell Group to go acquire $1 billion in marketing and PR firms in an effort to elect Democrats in the coming election. The WPP group does similar for the Republicans. Absolutely, in the current state of politics, both parties are being bought by very rich people. Robert Crawford says, Jeff, how do you feel about this continuum I made for when a sovereign meets another sovereign? Assimilation, segregation, isolation, subjugation, eradication. Thoughts and pick one, please, sir. Assimilation, segregation, isolation, subjugation. Yeah, I think it makes sense in terms of describing a progression of tactics that leads to the extinction of people, but it doesn't tell the whole story. When a people comes in the land of another people, like the Europeans came to North America, there were Native Americans there. This whole sequence of events happened for some Native Americans who ended up being subjugated and isolated. However, some other Native Americans, they integrated culture and they made babies with the coming Europeans. So reality is just a little more complex than this sequence of events. But your sequence of events does happen. Apple Fritter says, California residents, vote Little, win big tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow is the vote for Patrick Little. I cannot wait to see. I'm not taking sides in the political race, but I cannot wait to see if Patrick Little can make it to second candidate and eventually get into a one-on-one with Dianne Feinstein. Is it Dianne Feinstein? I think that's her name.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
All right, Mark McCall says, hey Jeff, ask Frame Game about solutions. Maybe we'll keep that for the end. For now, we will look at what do the leaks reveal about the behavior of journalists. And at some point, I wouldn't even call them journalists. At least they are not agents of the kind of the ideal journalist that we tend to think of. They are really political agents that are close to the media industry.
Yep. Yeah. Well, what we're going to get into is the level above it, to think about the stakeholders involved, and what we're going to transition to now with this Share Blue memo is exactly how the heads of these media influence pressure groups think. And not just that, it's really a crystal ball. This was should we turn to it right now, or do you have any more?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay. All right. So I'm actually going to do a screen share for this. So give me a moment, because I've actually sort of gone point by point on this entire 37-page memo for this. So
if you have a link, you can send it to me too. It will be better to illustrate on my side.
Yep. All right. Give me a second while I pull it up. Here is the script. There's some other versions that might be a little cleaner for viewing, but let me know if this works.
All right, I have it here. Democracy matters. Strategic plan for action.
Yep. So if you don't know who this is a memo from David Brock. Are you familiar with Media Matters, Jeff?
I am, from digging myself through the WikiLeaks during the Trump election. I've seen his role in the circles of John Podesta, and so that's where I know him from.
Yep. All right. So let's go through this. He is Media Matters is they posit themselves as a kind of as a media watchdog, which is a set of entities. These are not the owners, for example, of CNN or ABC or the New York Times or Facebook, right? You wouldn't call them the sponsors. And what they try to do is, either through financial or through sort of soft dollars or favor for favors, or through outright coercive threats, they exert control over the media through the tactics that we're going to see. So here is David Brock is sort of an instrumental part of the DNC information flow. He's a long time. He's one of the most powerful guys, essentially, in the left-wing media
tonight
apparatus.
At 7:30 p.m. Oops, I'm
has
sorry.
Been from.
I'm sorry, I'm having problem here, and I was playing audio on top of your on top of your voice. Sorry, you can restart.
Sure. So here is a memo from January 2017. So that you can see the impact of what we're going to read now, take a trip back in your mind to the halcyon days of January 2017. All of us were drunk with glory on the win of a lifetime with Trump. The alt-right had essentially never been stronger. There were all these questions about the future. How is it going to grow? How is it going to develop? It's unstoppable. It just seems to snowball more and more. Yeah, there were these weird protests going on in the street, but our biggest problem was Antifa using physical violence. Everyone still had their YouTube channels. Everyone still had their Facebook accounts. There was still free speech on the internet. This was right. So that was January 2017. And here is the media strategy memo for how to take on Trump that Media Matters circulated. So I'm going to go through it page by page. So I'm going to see what you're looking at we're going to start at page 1. Let me just pull up this screen with you on it so I can see that you're there. All right. It's actually page 1 in the lower right-hand corner.
All right.
And you'll so here it says, we are going to fight. The second paragraph says, we are going to resist the normalization of Donald Trump, his every conflict of interest, his every bit of cronyism, his every move towards authoritarianism, his every subversion of our democratic systems and principles. Right. So they're saying we're going to wage an anti-normalization campaign. So I've pulled up that is the overarching strategic goal of the sort of Trump era, is this anti-normalization. So now let's look at how they seek to go about the non-normalization of Trump, despite him winning. So in page 2 here, sorry, I have all the highlights on my screen. It says, we will fully adapt to this new reality and we will win. And they talk about how we lost this election because of social media. And what we need to do is we need to shut it down. We need to shut down anyone in the alt-right. And what we need to do is we need to get Google and Facebook to take them off their platforms so that they can't transmit any information.
It's amazing because this guy is the guy who then wrote an article about Warski Live on his website, Media Matters, which led to a strike be given to a Warski Live show on which I was.
Right. Well, you're going to see this memo is sprinkled with the scalps of their political enemies. I'll point it out every time. I am going to see if I can pull this up on my screen too, maybe just to. But this shows direct collaboration with Facebook. So check this out. I'm going to do a screen share. One sec. Share my screen. Okay. Share screen. Oh, here it is. All right. Okay. Can you see the red now on it?
Yeah, I can see it.
All right. So here
I can see a Twitter page right now. You are showing me a Twitter page.
Oh, maybe that's on delay. Oh, I see. I'll switch the screens. Is that
okay?
All right. So here on page 2 of the memo, here's how we're going to destroy the momentum of alternative media. And remember, at that time, we were really riding high. We really thought we'd still have freedom of speech on the internet. So it says, here's what success will look like. Internet, and point number 2, internet and social media platforms like Google and Facebook will no longer uncritically and without consequence host and enrich fake news sites and propagandists. So they basically work together with Google and Facebook to get them to change their terms of services and to inflict pain on them whenever they didn't. So note that this memo, as early as January 2017, is already talking about their strategy to impeach Trump. Mm-hmm. Right? This is January 2017. This is 2 months after the election, they're already talking about impeachment.
I always wonder where this crazy idea of impeaching Trump came, because I read this in some leftist blogs and some leftist mainstream media outlets. I was like, where are they getting this idea that they can do that?
Yeah, well, it's part of the non-normalization media. Like and I'll show you the examples of this where they all have the same collusion. They all release the same articles the same day with the exact same frames and just changing a couple words in the title. So here they talk about CREW, which is one of the organs. It's one of the basically non-affiliated affiliates of the Share Blue Media Matters watchdog enterprise. Okay. CREW is a nonpartisan ethics watchdog group. Nonpartisan. They're going to, so remember, these are like 501c3s and 501c4s, which can only be like in existence and have tax exempt status if they are serving the public interest. And this is a directly political play to try to use a quote under the guise of being a nonpartisan ethics watchdog group to use the media to delegitimize Trump so that they can garner public support for impeachment. So now check this out. The first bullet point. Remember, JF, January 2017.
Okay.
First bullet point. Trump will be afflicted by a steady flow of damaging information, new revelations, and inability to avoid conflict issues. They're saying what we're going to do is we are going to do a steady drip, 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 a steady flow. That's exactly what happened. Everyone has been saying for the past year and a half, where are these leaks coming from? How come there's a new one every week? Why is it dripping like this? And this is the media strategy of the nonpartisan ethics watchdog.
So everything we've said is just a deployed strategy by center agents like the Media Matter guy, David Brock.
Yes, and his large affiliate network, which is really the way to understand this. Like, it's bigger than Brock. It's bigger than again, they're the messenger from 300. This is, he talks about what his role with this memo is for his organization, Share Blue, to be the dynamic nucleus of a multi-platform media company, and then use this nonpartisan media company as a sledgehammer to impeach the president. Now, there are some, now look at this. Remember, January 2017, bullet point number 2, Trump allies will be forced to step down or change course due to news pushed by Share Blue. The fucking honesty to talk about it this point blank, saying what we're going to do is ally by ally, we are going to get Trump's, if we can't take him down, we are going to get one by one all of his people in the administration to get removed. And remember, this is exactly what happened. Remember, Steve Bannon was our guy coming into January 2017. We had Carmucci and the Mooch and 100 other guys, it seemed. And we had I don't know who was the original press secretary, right? Everybody, one by one, was targeted by these selective news stories that were then done as if every single one of them, every newspaper would say it all at the same time. And there's a great meme about this. I'm actually going to pause to show you.
And these journalists, they present all of this as, oh, wow, look at this. The Trump administration is failing. Well, you planned his failure before he had even begun.
Exactly. The whole thing is so morally bankrupt. But here, I'm going to, there's a great, here's a good example of it, of collusion in framing among all media companies simultaneously. So here is here are just the headlines from one speech from Trump's nomination. And I'm going to pull this up on the screen so that you have to see it to believe it. Hold on a second. Here you go. So, let me full screen. Why is that not? All right. So, do you see these headlines from? Are these clear on the screen? Oh, what's this? Okay. So basically, this is the Washington Post headline. Remember, this is the day after Trump's Republican nomination speech. Washington Post headline: In acceptance speech, Trump's America is a dark and desperate place. CBS News: Donald Trump offers dark vision of America in GOP convention speech. NBC News: Donald Trump takes America on a journey to the dark side. CNBC: Trump's emotional and dark message, how it will play out. Rolling Stone: Watch Donald Trump's dark, fear-mongering RNC speech. Huffington Post: Donald Trump's dark and scary night. Mother Jones: Donald Trump and the dark soul of the GOP. New Yorker: Donald Trump's dark convention speech. Nation: Donald Trump's angry
This guy
dark
overdid
convention.
it. He used dark 2 times. It's like they're getting points. They're getting rewarded for the number of times they can use dark.
Right. So when we get to the journal list, you'll see how things like this happen, right? This is total. I mean, what are the odds of dozens of theoretically independent newspapers written by a journalist who just wants to write a story about this to all use the exact identical frame the same day, using the same word at the same time about the same event? Like one totally obscure framing word. I mean, this is what happens time and again. You cannot think of these as independent institutions. They are essentially part of a relatively top-down but somewhat democratic set of stakeholders, including these businesses and political groups that we're talking about right now with the memo. So that's an example of the frame games there. So now what's really interesting is I highlighted in dots here that Share Blue will achieve financial stability while diversifying content offerings. So this is one of these what success will look like, but we don't need to hit it, right? Because these are not independent organizations. Like you can't think of what they're doing as a strictly like, as a business for making money necessarily. It's for the ecosystem itself. It's a network-wide event. So now we're going to get to the parade of bragging about scalps. So they bill themselves as a progressive media watchdog and rapid response research center, which just means like
rapid response.
Right, research center. Meaning like what they'll do is they will dox and harass people to intimidate, coerce. They're dirt peddlers. They're professional dirt peddlers who brag about having, on the minute staffs of people to look up damaging information about anybody on demand and then disseminate that information to the media. So we're going to get to that in a sec, but I'm going to read just a little bit of setup here. So here he says in the competitive analysis section, they're complaining about Breitbart News, which, if you remember, in January 2017 was almost set to overtake Fox. Breitbart was so huge in the election that a lot of people thought that they were going to basically displace a lot of Fox News. This is before Bannon got cut off from the head and before sort of Tucker Carlson, arrived on the scene with Fox and they got rid of Megyn Kelly and all that. But here they're complaining that Breitbart has received millions from extremist billionaires like the Mercer family. And he's provided a nexus point to the so-called alt-right. We're going to get to that phrase, so-called alt-right, a little bit later. But here's the newest branding for American white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and misogyny to exploit vulnerabilities through the media landscape, right? It's not just that they're putting information out, just like the left-wing, media, political partisans are putting out information. It has to be an exploitation because they're running ads that work or they're doing messaging that works. So anyway, with a powerful ally in the White House, Breitbart plans to export its brand of anti-establishment racism on a global scale.
Anti-establishment racism.
Right. I mean, the funny thing about that phrase is, like, if you're going to say that minorities don't have institutional power, then how can anti-establishment also be racism?
Yeah.
Like, okay. Anyway, so remember, this is not intended for our eyes. This is going out to potential fundraisers who will basically buy a semi-equity stake in the success of this. That is, they will be able to have, sort of influence in the network. They will have their strategic goals met. So all of what I'm going to point out here in circles is Media Matters bragging about how they have no platformed, demonetized, doxed, harassed, or basically like destroyed the livelihoods of various people over the past couple of years. So here's the first one here. Stop Donald Trump's phone interview privileges. Media Matters was the first to call out national cable broadcast networks for allowing Trump to phone into their shows instead of forcing him to appear via satellite or in studio. Because of this, Trump could appear on more shows. So basically what they're saying is, and remember, all of this, JF, is being done using racism as the crutch. It's the same thing they did in 1953, alleging racism to get things shut down, to threaten advertiser boycotts, to threaten loss of political privileges, to threaten loss of donor base. Like, this is what they use as this guise of stamping out racism to basically wage this non-normalization campaign. And like little things like why stopping the president's phone privileges so that all national cable broadcast networks they universally form a phalanx to prevent the president from conducting phone interviews in order for no other reason than to limit his mobility.
And what they call phone interview privilege is just the fact that Donald Trump was accepting to use the phone as a media to communicate with these media.
Yes. Look at this. Read the last paragraph of this. As a result of our campaign urging major networks to correct course, CBS News and NBC News publicly stated they discontinued Trump's phone privileges, meaning he can no longer call in to CBS or NBC to conduct interviews. He'd need to fly there on his jet and then personally show up in studio. Eventually, others followed our pressure on CBS and NBC, and Trump's ability to control the news cycle from the comfort of his home was greatly reduced. Do you understand the tactics here? It's all about destabilization of the individual person rather than winning the war of ideas.
Yeah.
Get used to that. All right.
And as a result, the American people has less access to Trump.
Exactly.
That's all they want.
Yep, these are the same people who campaigned for, say, digital voting, so that lazy voters who are overwhelmingly left wing don't need to leave the comfort of their home to vote on election day, even though that opens up an incredible amount of potential fraud with digital, hacking and things like that. But anyway, this is just deliberate discomfort. There's no reason to do this other than to limit the flow of information and deliberately destabilize somebody. But this is what they do. This is your independent ethics watchdog. Okay, the Media Matters plan. Media Matters will push back on conservative misinformation across all channels in the information ecosystem, and specifically neutralize the effects and infrastructure of the newly empowered alt-right. Okay, so we'll focus on our efforts. Read the second one. Develop technologies to serve as an early warning system for fake news and inoculate social media platforms from what they frame as exploitation and abuse. Remember, this was before YouTube implemented its digital flagging systems. This was before the online hate index of the ADL. This is before YouTube hired 10,000, a company that's already not profitable, hiring 10,000 more employees just to look at videos all day to judge whether or not they're hate speech. I'm not joking about those figures. I can pull that up for you, by the way. Yeah. They literally...
No, I was aware of these figures. I was just not aware that it was a plan by Media Matters even before it happened.
Yes, exactly. Because if you remember, the alt-right was totally ascendant, and it was totally decentralized. And there was this feeling that, they don't have enough manpower to manually go through it. And so what Media Matters, their media campaign is to get control of Facebook and Google by any means necessary. And we're going to see a lot more of that in a minute.
Now, I do like the beginning of the next paragraph. Traditional news outlets are dying.
Right.
Yep, you got that right.
So remember, this is all about hit pieces. Opposition research is how they euphemistically frame it, and just media monitoring But what it is it's total censorship. It exists for one function, which is to crush through personal attack rather than through debate, except it has this influence on the entire network ecosystem. This is so anyway, here's a few instructive, here's a brag. Over the years, Media Matters has won or assisted in a number of tangible victories, from getting Glenn Beck kicked off cable news to holding 60 Minutes accountable for faulty Benghazi report. That is, for doing a report on him, for calling attention to the Benghazi scandal of Hillary Clinton. So check out this passage. The strategy for the next 4 years on media advocacy: punishing, enabling, and complacency. We are going to punish news organizations and tech organizations that enable free speech from right-wing nationalists.
That's what we've seen in the anti-super chats article that have popped out in mainstream media as a result of the Warski live show and of other shows, where they say we're going to punish YouTube. We're going to say, hey, YouTube, you're making money out of racism.
Yep. Well, that's exactly what happened. If you remember, it was the Wall Street Journal article that preceded the adpocalypse, and it was because there were only 9 videos that they deemed as having hate speech on it, that YouTube, I think, was threatened to lose about $750 million in aggregate ads over I'm sorry. Well, I'm getting a. Can you hear the?
No, I can't
hear that phone call. Okay, all right.
But you mute yourself if you have something to do.
All right, that's fine. So here's this section. Media Matters will be vigilant in holding news media accountable for even the slightest bit of normalization of Trump.
Oh my God. So they're not even they're not after hate speech. They're after, if you just like Trump, you're part of our target list.
Right. Well, JF, you have to understand, hate speech is the whole concept of hate speech is part of a larger, it's a tactic. Hate speech regulation is part of the larger tactic of shifting the Overton window through defining the range of normal. The end goal is not policing hate speech. The end goal is policing the normality of public opinion, the range of public opinions that are deemed acceptable, reasonable, sensible, radical, and unthinkable. Okay, so it's all just whatever gets you there. It's completely antithetical. If you have autism, this should be driving you absolutely insane, because there's nothing farther from scientific debate than the fact that these guys are going to try to dig up your porn history to get you out of office if they can. Any little thing they can. And meanwhile, they're the ethics watchdog. All right. So, okay. So, and then, this, of course, this combination of monologuing about what evils they'll commit, coming back to these euphemistic framings. We will encourage journalists to defend standard practices like a protective press pool and media credentialing that is preventing this ascendant alternative media from getting press credentials, and striving for higher standards against this new threat, which is what led to things like Snopes fact-checking and Facebook's attempt at scorecards of
the whole fake news, the whole extended phenotype of fake news, and this whole meme that mainstream media has tried to start.
Right. So when Breitbart applied for permanent, so to give an example, when Breitbart applied for permanent Senate gallery press credentials, Media Matters was quick to act by advising the credentialing committee of the myriad ways that Breitbart violated the requirements. Additionally, Media Matters did something that the committee was unable to do: a deep dive study of Breitbart content, reviewing thousands of their stories to demonstrate that they did not meet the credentialing requirement for original reporting. Media Matters also first sounded the alarm about Breitbart's international expansion and began working with journalists in the United States and abroad. Now listen to how they frame this: to educate them on Breitbart's model, as well as the larger universe of alt-right activity for which Breitbart is the nexus. So what they're saying is, we've worked with an international cabal of international media organizations to prevent Breitbart from expanding abroad.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so most significantly, we help journalists understand the symbiotic relationship between Breitbart and opposition political parties so that they can accurately report on the danger that is spreading across Western democracies. So I'm going to pause now to explain what that means when they say they are going to educate journalists on how to accurately report on the
Yeah, because
dangers.
this all sounds like coded language that said precisely not to say like we're strategizing and we're gonna play dirty, but it's all framed in a politically correct language.
Right. Well, at least part of it is, although the mask certainly slips from time to time. But here I'm going to pull up a thread now that shows you the way that this works. And again, we're trying to disabuse you of the notion that there's journalistic freedom with respect to how journalists are even allowed to cover things like the alt-right in the in mainstream media. So here I'm going to pull up on the screen now the writing guidelines for this is the AP and Reuters have writing guides for how mainstream journalists have to write about different concepts so that they are all on the same page with how they report on it. Okay, so here is the AP. Remember, this is the Associated Press. Associated Press and Reuters are like the largest distribution and news aggregation networks in the country. And what they say is, if you're going to reproduce an AP or Reuters article that is about the alt-right, if you're going to write about this content, here's how you need to describe it. So you need to use the phrase "so-called" with alt-right scare quotes around it. Okay, so I'm going to show some examples of this. Here's the style guide. Okay, here's how whenever you say the word alt-right, you have to do it as follows. It says it's a name currently embraced by some white supremacists and white nationalists to refer to themselves and their ideology, which emphasizes preserving and protecting the white race in the United States, in addition to or over other traditional conservative positions such as limited low taxes and strict law and order. That actually, other than the white supremacist allegation, that sounds like they actually do have an understanding of the core tenets of much of the alt-right.
Mm-hmm.
So they know the information, but now look at how they mandate journalists from CNN and NBC and the New York Times to actually cover it. Okay? Here you go. I'm going to zoom out here so that you can see it. Usage. Alt-right. Alt-right in quotation marks, hyphen, and lowercase. May be used in quotes or modified in the as in the self-described or so-called alt-right.
So you can never be alt-right, really. You're just so-called alt-right, self-described alt-right, or alt-right.
Yes. Well, JF, this is the strategy that I've covered many times before called unthinging, which is the idea of saying, rather than debating the merits of something, simply preventing the concept from entering common parlance. That is, getting rid of the idea altogether, so that not only can you not talk about it, but you can't scale on top of it as an intellectual concept. And so they are not allowed, mainstream media journalists are not allowed to use the word alt-right unless at some point in the article they say self-described with quotes around it. Once you see it, once I tell you this now, you will see it everywhere. And I'm going to show you a dozen of examples of it in a minute. Yeah. But here you go. Here's how you have to write about it. Avoid using the term generically and without definition. And wait till you see the definition. However, because it is not well known and the term may exist primarily as a public relations device to make its supporters' actual beliefs less clear and more acceptable to a broader audience. In the past, we have called such beliefs racist, neo-Nazi, or white supremacist.
Oh my God, that's all where it comes from.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering, why do they keep doing it? There you go. You have the coaching of the journalists right here. They told them that neo-Nazi, white supremacism, and racist are synonyms of the alt-right. Alt-right is just a new brand for these IDs.
JF, it's worse than that. It's not that they're like encouraging. They're saying it's a violation of journalistic standards if you do anything but call them racist neo-Nazis. Do you understand? You can't publish an article without doing this, or you're violating their journalistic requirements. Look at this boilerplate. And look how they stress it. Again, just to emphasize in case you didn't get it, again, comma, whenever alt-right is used in a story, be sure to include a definition, an offshoot of conservatism mixing racism, white nationalism, and populism, or more simply, a white nationalist movement. Here is an example of the AP News report. With an ideology that's a mix, Riley, can you see all this on the screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
With an ideology that's a mix of racism, white nationalism, and old-fashioned populism, the quote alt-right has burst into the collective consciousness since members showed up at the Republican National Convention to celebrate Trump's nomination last summer. This is what the largest mainstream mass media information distribution centers require you to do to publish an article in the mass media. Okay? And they formed a literal phalanx on it because you'd be violating journalistic standards if you don't. Okay, so now check this out, all right? So I'll just show you some examples of this, lest you doubt how pervasive the framing of it. I defy people in the chat to show me examples of an article that does not use the phrase so-called alt-right with scare quotes around it.
There's actually 2 levels of quoting in that title. So-called, single quote, alt-right, double quote.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That's Business Insider. Okay, here's CNN, white supremacist, Richard Spencer. Okay, so here you go. And here you go. Last month, Richard Spencer espousing racist ideals. Remember, this is not like opinion. This is political news.
Yeah.
They're calling this news. And remember, the reason is because you are not allowed to let the person define the story. This idea that there's any potential for neutral coverage, disabuse yourself of that. They're not allowed to be neutral. They are forced by their sponsors and stakeholders to call you racist. Their hands are tied. Now, I'm sure they do it gladly, but don't hope for positive media coverage because they would be fired for it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right, hold on a sec. I'll just pull up a few more examples. I just want you to see it. It's useful. I like to do source quotes. There's source material here. Okay, Mother Jones, how the so-called, quote, alt-right, every single time, always with the boilerplate injected into it. I mean, everything, whether like political research associates, like every single thing, right? The rise of the so-called, quote, alt-rights. It's the boilerplate they have to use. Okay? And so... This is how this is done with the frame games in media. So here's, for example, the Columbia Journalism Review telling their journalism students, issuing this guidance that you have to stop saying the word alt-right. You can't use the term, right? Because it's about branding and the associations. You cannot let your political enemies define yourself. Remember, journalists are under they have a journalistic ethic that requires them to be neutral. They are not allowed by their own journalistic code to insert their own views into politics. They have to report, or at least to minimize it. They can't take sides, or else that's opinion. That's why there's 2 different departments for opinion and news. But it's not news. It's public relations.
You know how people in the alt-right sometimes use the triple parenthesis for Jewish people? I have the impression that the world you're presenting in front of me is a world where people have won and they've decided to use a certain set of quotes around the name of alt-righters, and they've actually succeeded at imposing that mediatic style. I'm thinking of an alternate world in which the alt-right would win and everyone would use the triple parenthesis.
Yep. Have you? I could take a bit of a detour now away from the Share Blue memo to show you more about how this tactic is used, or I could go back to the memo. Do you need to do super chats, or how are you feeling? How's the chat feeling?
You take it where you want. We can do super chats later. You can explore one of these 2 branches, then we do super chat, then we can conclude.
Okay.
Well, we can conclude with your final branch there.
Sure. I'll walk people through who haven't seen this before, just because I'm having fun here. This tactic is used as a frame game to prevent concepts from being a part of the Overton window. So a couple months ago, and I have a little typo here. There should be an extra T in identitarian, but here's an example of the Overton window with different ideologies mapped across it. Right, you've got on the right-wing scale of it, centrist, conservative, white identitarian, meaning wanting the same kinds of identity politics as Jews and African Americans and others, white nationalist, sort of taking that into sort of the ethno-state ideal, and then white supremacist, believing in superiority. And so what a lot of people are strategically discombobulated by is they think, well, look, I'm just saying I want the same rights for white people. Why are you calling me a white supremacist? How come there's no such thing as being for? Why is it that the Overton window seems to skip directly to this, right? And it's because of this concept. JF, once I've told you this, I promise you will see it everywhere now. Mm-hmm. Okay? It is the tactic of using strategic framing to remove links of sequentially graded concepts from the common parlance, from public understanding, from private understanding, so that there is no distance between the two things. And what they do is they say there's no such thing as this. They say there's no such thing as a white identitarian. There's no such thing as a white nationalist. All there is centrist, conservative, and if you're anything to the right of conservative, you're a white supremacist. This is why there is what I call the zone of unthinking. And
I mean, I would argue that by calling Trump a white supremacist, they often enlarge your window to actually delete conservative too.
Right. Well, that's true, because things that were otherwise considered white identitarian that had overlapped with conservative are now, like this whole area that sort of overlaps with both conservative, like that overlap is done away with because there's no such thing as white identitarian. You move straight into white supremacist territory. But this is why they have to. This is why there's the war on words. It's the meta war. That's like the cloak and dagger tactic of mass media, which is that they just prevent these things. I mean, the historical record is filled with hundreds of examples of these really incredibly insightful terms and concepts that were all memory hold. So what it does is it shifts the window. So I'll give an example here, right? So to use this for a non-political concept, right? If a centrist view, I know there's a bit of a digression. I'll get back to Cher Blue in a second.
I think it's interesting to see the king example.
Okay. So here's an easy let's just say you wanted to challenge an establishment or not normalize or instigate subversion against a ruling king, right? So openly calling for the overthrow of the king would be treason and insta-death to those who said it. But skepticism and doubt might be allowed. So imagine an Overton window that looks as follows, okay? The policy, if you're talking about challenging the president or the king's legitimacy, is that the king is the rightful king and there is no such thing as a doubt, right? And then that might be the status quo. A little bit more subversive might be that king is the rightful king and the doubters are wrong. So it's not even saying that, like, it's saying that there is doubt. There is such a thing as doubt, but they're wrong. This is the position of free speech and debate, but simply saying that the other side is wrong. Mm-hmm. And there is the sensible position, if that king might be legitimate, but the doubters make good points. That is acknowledging the good points of doubt of the people who want to overthrow the king, but not being persuaded by it necessarily. This is the sort of idealist classical liberal position. And then a little bit more is that king is probably not legitimate. I have serious doubts. And then finally, that king is not legitimate, overthrow the king now. So what they do is, because this is a toehold, because these levels of intellectual freedom, considering the good points, considering the merit of the points,
that's problematic for them.
What they have to do is they have to say there's no such thing as doubt. Okay, so what they'll do is they will say the so-called quote doubters. I promise you're going to see this everywhere. Whenever you see so-called hyphen with scare quotes following, you are watching an unthinking happening. All right. Okay, you're going to see the same thing when you examine many historical records of identity politics and places where losers have lost, where winners have written history. And what they'll say is that you don't really have a position. You have a position that is masquerading as something else. There's no such thing as being a white identitarian. So I'll show you some examples of this. Hold on a second.
Now, before you show us that, I will call for a break. I need a minute or two. And so this is also an occasion for you to relax. And everyone on the chat, we will be back in about 2 minutes.
All right, great.
All right, I am back. Are you there, Firm Game?
I sure am. I want to finish this point, unless you want to move on to something.
Yeah, you go for it.
Okay, so where we left off is I was showing the example outside of like white advocacy to show how this works in purpose. So the unthinking strategy is designed. And sorry, let me pull this back up. It is designed to make doubt become not a thing. That is, either you are 100% agreed that the king is the rightful king, or that you need to overthrow them. One being a point of zero resistance, one being a point of 100% resistance, and not allowing for the verbal expression or intellectual scaling off of foundational ideas like there may be points on both sides. So doubt itself becomes unthinked as its own idea. There becomes no intermediary idea between belief and treason. And it redraws the map of public opinion as follows. This is what Media Matters is talking about with how they
tweeted these things in August 2017, and we've seen it happen for a year since then.
Yep.
That's beautiful.
So I'm going to show you some things here. So the result is that but notice how it shifts the entire window, right? So now what this does is this makes POC identitarianism sensible. Mm-hmm. It shifts the whole thing. So the idea is that it normalizes POC identitarianism while making white identitarianism unthinkable because it's indistinguishable from white supremacy. Now, once you recognize this unthinking tactic, you will see it everywhere. So here are just a few examples, all right? Here's complex. There's no such thing as reverse racism, right? There's no such thing as whiteness. There's no such thing as white pride. There's no such thing as white people. There's no such thing as white identity. There is no white country. There is no white culture. It's not saying, well, here are the aspects that are or aren't. What it's saying is we are going to take the entire thing. It's like removing like Jenga pieces out of the intellectual structure of. And remember, these ideas are how you build the mosaic, the tapestry of your own thought. Mm-hmm. This is how the public gets. If you don't have, think about how useful a concept like cuck is. That one word has so many different associations. It's so dynamic. Like, think about how that one single word forced so many adaptations from the neoconservatives during the rise of Trump. Yeah. Because there's no way to maintain in the human brain's working memory the incredible amount of associations captured by that one word. It is so intellectually and mentally taxing to try to express in 300 words what you can with one word with deeply loaded associations. So the best thing to do linguistically to make it so that you can't lose the argument is to forbid the other side from using concepts or words that express them. So this is the education campaign. And it's met with threats of advertiser boycotts, of allegations of racism, of political favors. So one last thing on this, and then I'll just turn back to. All right. Why don't I turn back now? There's a lot more there, but let me turn back to the memo so that we can wrap it up.
All right.
Okay. So, all right. So here we go. We're now on page 8. Remember, January 2017. So here is still part of the strategy section. Relying on human media monitors is no longer sustainable. Fake news and alt-right communities are multiplying exponentially. Oh, by the way, I wanted to show you this. I just remembered why I wanted to show you, JF. It's the evolution of the term fake news. Sorry, I promise this is my last diversion.
No problem. These divergences are absolutely awesome. In fact, one member of our audience, Quebec, was so enthusiastic about your speech on the centrist and the displacement and the unthinging. He gave us $200. He says,
Wow.
Holy crap, the guy is blowing my mind. I knew there was bias, but I had no idea it was so organized and pervasive.
Yep. Well, we haven't even gotten to the journalist, but we'll see if we have time for all this. So here you go. I wanted to show you what they did to fake news. See, what they did to the term fake news, if you remember, first it was their weapon, fake news, as a tool to deplatform alternative media. And they inflated the mimetic gravity of the term fake news. Right? They got it to encompass all of these negative associations, this bundle of negativity and vitriol. But then Trump co-opted the term. And by successfully co-opting it, what he did is he basically said, thanks for inflating the mimetic gravity of this term. Now I'm going to use it to destroy you with it, because now it's going to be redefined to mean you instead of me. And so if you remember, right. So first, this is like November 2016, how fake news helped Trump win the election. The fake news we saw on election day. This is on November 8th on election day, right? And then what happened?
So that's one thing that wasn't clear to me. Was fake news really firstly used by mainstream media, or did it emerge from forums?
Oh, no, it emerged from mainstream media. And then look at this. The entire coordinated mainstream media response, the same week, JF, all came out with these articles. Trump is trying to redefine fake news to mean us, not them. We can't let him. Okay?
Yeah.
Here's the Washington Post. It's time to retire the tainted term fake news. It's saying, okay, guys, look, it's being used against us.
Abandon the ship.
These are journalists commanding other journalists to unthing the term, to remove it from common parlance. Because now it is being used, now they have appropriated, and it is a meme that can be used against us. So rather than combating whether or not something is fake news, we're just going to say you can't use that word because that word is dehumanizing, or that word is racist or sexist for whatever reason. By the way, it would be fun to do an episode on a game I like to play with myself sometime in the shower. I used to do. It's a game that I call Ism Proof That Idea. And it's a 2-player game. And what you do is you take any sentence in the world, kind of like what you asked me to do with like saying a sentence and then making a clickbait.
Yeah.
And so what I do is I say any sentence in the world, and I will get a third-party observer or you to experience the fear and cognitive dissonance flinching that sentence might be racist or sexist. You can play it with any number of the isms.
Oh, right? God, can we try it?
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead, give me.
I really say anything that I find not racist?
We'll test it in the chat. I'm a little rusty. This was a game I played like in 2016 and early 2017s, but I'm pretty sure I can get some people in the chat. So this is an interactive chat experience. Let's see who wins.
So the chat needs to make a sentence, and you're gonna explain to them how it's racist?
No, you're going to make a sentence. I am going to accuse you of racism, and then the chat is going to write in yes or no whether or not they, for a split second, flinched and thought, "Holy shit, that might be racist." Now, this is a tough crowd to do. This is a tough crowd to do this on.
Yeah, it's the toughest crowd, but maybe you will win them.
Let me try. I'm going to see if I can get a few people here.
Okay, so I always buy my water bottled. I think it has better taste.
Okay. The first thing you need to understand, JF, is that you exist in a system of white supremacy. And in the actions that you are taking, whether you think so or not, are actively or passively perpetuating the legacy of slavery, discrimination, and persecution of Black Americans. Not all Black Americans have access to clean water. Did you know that? Did you know that there is systemic oppression against African Americans countrywide because they do not have equal access under the law? And this injustice you perpetuate by not being a positive enough ally to Black people. So you may think you're just drinking water, but what you're really doing is perpetuating the system of white supremacy. Okay, that wasn't my best effort,
No,
but
the chat tells us if it was somehow realistic in your mind, and if you felt some of the things pop out from the frame game discourse, press 1. If you were totally isolated and there's not a single word that touched you at the feeling level or that awakened this possibility that he may be right, press 2.
Yeah, the way it should be played is by sort of Socratic method. Like I should have asked you questions about your habits of water and whether or not that you share with others, whether or not you are doing enough, whether or not you're a positive ally, whether or not you acknowledge your own privilege and that there's unequal access to these things.
I mean, considering the difficulty of the crowd, because they are very resistant to that kind of discourse because they are trained to understand SJW tactics, and you kind of fell into stereotypes of SJW, but still you probably touched about 40% of the early responders. There's 40% ones, so it's for this crowd, it's quite impressive.
Well, let me tell you the purpose of the game, JF. The purpose, so I went to college, in a place where it was very nice on campus, but the moment you stepped off campus, there were a lot of ruffians, shall we say, and those ruffians were frequently conducting amateur terrorism on students on campus, and one of their favorite games was a soft version of the knockout game where instead of hitting you, they would usually, like a gang of 3 would be walking down the street and one of them would basically fake throw a punch at you, get you to flinch, and then basically go on their way. And that would be victory if you flinched. And the purpose of this game is to show that anything can induce that state of fear and holy shit, is there any possible way? If I can get you for a split second to get to feel that, then I can pivot off of it, and I can scale it, and I can start to use that emotionally to distort the audience, to get them on my side, to increase my victimhood voltage, so I have a moral imperative in the argument, and you owe me something. You understand? It's a flinch game. It's not about logically convincing someone for the long term.
Absolutely, I understand.
Okay, all right. Enough of that diversion. We will get back to the memo. Okay, so here you go. Media monitoring enables us to identify. They brag about forcing changes here. Predictive technology. So again, this is all before all the digital hate speech stuff. Collaboration with social media platforms. Outlets that push fake news are completely dependent on Facebook to spread their lies and ad networks like Google to fund them. Media Matters has unique insight to help fix problems in this part of the media landscape. Unique insight means they have a billy club to the throats of any advertisers. After Facebook responded to our campaign by acknowledging the problem of fake news and agreeing to do something about it, we began a dialogue. So you're learning now. What was the impetus for the fake news and deplatforming movement?
Yeah.
In 2017, it became clear from these conversations that Facebook needed our help in fully understanding the problem and identifying concrete solutions. By the way, this is the same way the ADL always talks about before they destroy your livelihood. Further, it also became clear that we had information and insight that they didn't have, and that was helpful in educating them on the full scope of the problem, meaning they have a team of lemmings who go through every single possible incriminating piece of content you ever produced, and then distorting it in the most like atrocity propaganda kind of way. For example, Media Matters had a detailed map of the constellation of right-wing Facebook pages that had been the biggest purveyors of Facebook news, as well as an insight into the food chain of Facebook's and how it was moving through the Facebook ecosystem. Right? This is how you get like God Emperor Trump with 300,000 likes getting taken down, or Britain First with 2 million likes getting taken down, more likes than the Labour Party getting taken down. Similarly, after Google revised their terms of service in order to prohibit so-called fake news sites from using their advertising network, it was Media Matters that had the information necessary to identify 40 of the worst fake news sites to which this policy applied. Do you understand? They are a pressure group.
Yeah.
And what they do is they apply pressure using economic terrorism, and it's much easier to just relent and appease to these groups than it is to stand on principle. And they know all the turnkeys to screw. All right. So here you go. More bragging. Got Facebook to commit to fighting the rise of fake news. Got them to, all right. Look at this. Our campaign was covered by prominent national political, business, and tech media outlets, and we've been engaging with Facebook leadership behind the scenes to share our expertise and offer input on developing meaningful solutions. All right, more on the strategy. Mobilize. Now look at this. The alt-right specializes in, I'm not even going to say their words, in sending information, and distinguishes itself from traditional right-wing media by its ability to self-organize. But it has several key vulnerabilities. This is the strategy memo for kicking us off mainstream media, which is what they did in 2017. They are largely dependent upon social media behemoths that tolerate their activity. Facebook, Reddit, YouTube, and Twitter have permitted the alt-right's presence, with some rare but notable exceptions. They operate on the edge of the law. Their efforts are largely financed on thin private margins. They're acknowledging we're scrappy underdogs. And their membership consists of weak individuals, often recruited into the movement because they fear or resent women and or harbor racial animosity. To stop that...
I'm a beast.
Look at this. They assume that no one will detect their information until people are already persuaded. To stop them, we need to become bigger and louder. Only through mass engagement, meaning mass engagement with big tech platforms and big media platforms to take them off, can we halt their spread of information. Media Matters will not just manage the effects of media fragmentation, it will leverage it. So here they have their Truth Squad, which if you remember, they had their, do you remember Correct the Record, JF?
Correct the Record. No.
Okay.
Oh, was it the kind of show where they were saying how much Trump is false and he lies all the time?
No, this was, so people post on 4chan and Reddit, and they come up with memes and arguments, and they spread information that way. But they don't get paid for it. They do it pro bono. They do it because they love it. And what happened was, as the left was getting crushed by the meme war in early 2016, Media Matters decided what they were going to do is start an extensive program to pay left-wingers to shitpost on the internet and to counter arguments in internet forums on Reddit, on 4chan, and Facebook groups. And the more arguments they made, that is, the more things that they rebutted, to make sure that no information from Pepe enthusiasts would go uncontested. Like they would get paid, by the hour or on commission for like the amount of truth correction they did on the internet. So imagine
all of these leftists that I've seen complain against Russian agents favoring the alt-right, they actually did it. They paid agents to troll on the internet.
Yes, well, it's the same thing that the left, I should say, this left and diversity industry behemoth does with protesters. If you remember the O'Keefe expose showing that basically through a string of non-disclosed independent contractors, the Hillary Clinton campaign arranged for paid protesters to show up to Trump rallies, and you get paid for doing it. I mean, this is part of and this is part of the George Soros money funding a lot of these like Antifa groups and funding the protest groups, and they get paid to get bussed in and get their $15 to, to, I think sometimes I've seen ads for $15 an hour and things like that, just to go there and riot, just to cause hell, just to contest. The idea is to never let the right-wing argument hit you head on and let its emotional appeal be uninterrupted. It's the same thing they do with what I call censorship by commentary, where they'll only release annotated versions of books, so that every couple paragraphs or so the flow is interrupted with a scholarly rebuttal. This is the new censorship technique. So anyway, they talk about, here's what's going to happen. Google is going to cut off pages from AdSense accompanying sites' access to revenue by pulling their access to Google's ad platform. If you remember, this is exactly what happened with James Alsop, with a number of other conservative platforms. It's happened to people who write to me about their blogs. They say, holy crap, I wasn't even a race realist, but I wrote one article about that was sympathetic to race realism, and now my AdSense doesn't work anymore. I mean, this is a 2017 thing, and it's because of this top-down, sponsor-driven, stakeholder-driven manipulation of the media. So then they go on to say part of the key strategies are to get key alt-right figures to lose credibility and influence in response to our research and pressure. Then they brag about pushing Roger Stone off of cable news. And then there's great stuff here with Russia. They say that what we're going to do is we are going to do a nonstop Russia and Putin drive. And let's see, I get some direct quotes. Sorry, brag about derailing Rudy Giuliani being elected to the cabinet. Bragging about exposing Koch brothers financing. I have a bunch of other points here, but a million things here. Okay, so here's another part of the strategy. Now again, Crew, this is their affiliate.
The non-profit.
Yes, the nonpartisan nonprofit. Knows how to use litigation, legal complaints, research, and press outreach to get results. So they're talking about lawfare. They're bragging about using their nonpartisan ethics front, shell company to get the president impeached and to get his people fired from his administration through the strategic use of lawfare. Doesn't even matter what the lawsuit is about. They're just going to flood him with legal complaints, litigation. And if you remember, there's these guys are drowning in legal fees. In fact, I'll pull up a direct quote from you here. Look at this. Here's an article from just 2 weeks ago from CNBC. And what does it say? Because remember, the overarching strategy is financial bankruptcy. Trump's allies are drowning in legal fees from the Russia probe. And then talks about how all these guys who are even name dropped, right? They just bragged about harassing Roger Stone. They're all drowning in legal fees. And that was exactly the strategy that they set in place a year and a half ago. Because economic bankruptcy is how they get you every single time, which is why your guys' super chats and developing a solid and financially stable alt-right or far right or nationalist or just pro-American political economy is so essential for our movement to grow. So anyway, this thing goes on and on and on. A steady stream. So here's part of how they're going to use lawfare. A steady stream of open records requests will keep constant attention by the media on Trump's unprecedented conflicts of interest. He wasn't even sworn in at this point, I think. This leaked in January 2017. Trump was elected.
I think he was entering office.
See, when did Trump when was he sworn in? January 20th, and this leaked January 17th, I believe. Let's see. I'm going to verify that right now because that's just such a galling fact. Let's see here. David Brock leaked share blue memo. Okay, so this was Oh, I'm sorry. January 26th, I see. So this was 6 days after getting into office.
Mhm.
Um,
So they have
he
it's clearly not been written in 6 days. So they were already at work as soon as they learned that Trump was elected.
Right. And note how they don't even have a particular thing that they're going after. They're just going to say a steady stream to run up these legal expenses, and that they'll use comprehensive and frequent litigation to compel openness and responsiveness. I will tell you, as an attorney, this paragraph, I hope that there's someone in the Trump administration who's listening to this stream right now, because that is a fantastic paragraph to cite in your summary judgment filing in direct response to their complaint, to say that this is a frivolous lawsuit.
The big problem is that these people are so organized. The person who does it to Trump is not the person who wrote that article. And so they're going to be able to plead that it wasn't a strategy because this document has been written by someone else than the lawyer that's actually suing Trump.
Wait, could you clarify that?
I'm just saying that using this for Trump to get away with a summary judgment would not work, because it's not Media Matters that's doing the actions. They are using subsidiaries, they are using friends, and it's probably that there will not be a possibility for Trump to demonstrate that this strategy is the one implemented by the specific lawyer that's involved in the Trump suits and in the Roger Stone suits.
Well, it depends. You might be able to prove a motive by showing a nexus between the organizations. And certainly, look, I'm not saying it's dispositive. I'm not saying you'd win the case, but I would absolutely, I mean, because basically what you can do is you can file what are called slaps, which are basically, they're lawsuits that basically punish plaintiffs for trying to bring like a frivolous lawsuit just to censor, intimidate, or silence. So, but I mean, what this is showing is we're going to sue you no matter what. We're going to keep a steady stream of it coming, and we are going to be as aggressive as possible. Really, regardless of whether or not there's anything here, because we make no specific allegations. All we do is promise to sue as often as we can. So anyway, I mean, it's just a data point. I think if it was more widely known, it would be useful. So anyway, I'll try to speed through the rest of this stuff. So. Right. Trump will be afflicted by a steady flow of damaging information. The press coverage we drive, both quantity and quality of Trump's conflicts of interest, will break internal records. We are going to do a record. It doesn't notice how they say both quantity and quality. That is, even if it's garbage, there's going to be so much of it, it's going to be record breaking. Does that sound familiar?
I mean, it seems that you're showing me the mastermind behind the last year and a half of my life. They planned everything.
Well, let me tell you something, JF. Independently, when you look up just who David Brock is, what his history is, his relationships with John Podesta and the Clinton administration, and how far back it all goes, and you see how much of a major power player this guy is, how tapped in he is to everything. The context of this is going to be made a lot more scary. But whatever. So look, then they brag about forcing the FEC, forced the FEC. Right? They're bragging about not just we educated the FEC. This is the Federal Election Commission. And they're bragging that we strong-armed them. Not that we showed them evidence and they independently came up with a ruling. We were responsible for forcing the Federal Election Commission to impose fines on our political enemies. We forced them. That's their brag. I mean, and look, forced. I mean, the whole thing is they brag about how extortionary they are. Fear is their number one weapon. It was true in 1953 as it is true today. And this is why I talked about that game, Can You Ism-Proof That Idea? Because what they do is they get marketing departments to flinch. And that flinch opens up these ridiculously low probability, but extremely high magnitude potential for diversity industry lawsuits. where you may open yourself up to a $300 million class action complaint. Do you know how many times the CNN has been sued for racial discrimination in the past decade?
I don't know.
And you think, oh, CNN always talking about diversity and how much they are constantly facing class action lawsuits for racial discrimination. And the more they win political favor with these organizations who are tapped into all the identity politics movers and shakers, then the more they buy themselves litigation insurance. It's
so
the
these
lamb's
guys,
blood.
they bully everyone, including the people on their side. And once they're correctly bullied, then they can say, "Oh, why don't you consult us about the state of the diversity in your coverage?"
Yep. Well, that's exactly what they do, and that's how they get them to force. Right? They have so many pressure points. They can get you on a media blitz by just getting their other allies to gang up on you. They can go after your advertisers. They can go after your customers by organizing customer boycotts with these hashtag campaigns that they talk about. Mm-hmm. They can go directly to student organizations who get paid. Remember, every single major college and university in America has identity politics full-time professionals who are trained with their African studies and their Latinx studies departments and their Afrocentrism. They're trained to be professional activists. They get paid to prosecute this stuff. Mm-hmm. So they just release the hounds throughout the network. And another day I can rip the Band-Aid off of that one. But here I'm just pulling up a recent class action racial discrimination suit that's growing exponentially, meaning what they're doing is the Media Matters folks and the National Action Network and all the other ungodly NGO fakers. They fake like they're basically independent authorities that can take care of government business and be outsourced to them. Like they go and they run up these public relations campaigns, and they put billboards on the side of bus stops in inner city Philadelphia to get people to sign on to class action lawsuits, promising them $1,000 if they just sign their name on the thing. It's disgusting. I can get on that another day. I'm sorry, I'm going off on too many tangents here. Let me wrap this up. All right. Share Blue will take back social media. For Democrats, we will delegitimize Donald Trump's presidency. Again, 6 days into his office. Here you go. Competitive analysis. We are not waiting to see what Trump does in office, but they're already throwing lawsuits at him. We do not give him the benefit of the doubt. We dedicate every day to calling him out. We are bold, full-throated, and not backing down. Kleptocracy, cooptation by Russia. This was before. I think this was even before the CIA memo, which was nothing. But anyway, these are. And they even describe themselves, this ethics, this blessed, sanctioned, nonpartisan group as a digital attacker, right? They need to constantly oscillate by showing their power levels and then claiming that they're just a nonpartisan group. And then they brag that they drove narrative shifting, hashtags and then they go through a bunch of examples of how they've maximized impact for all of their smear campaigns.
So Share Blue is a digital attacker, and I see that they have a Twitter page. What are these bullies doing on Twitter? If I said I'm a digital attacker, I would be kicked off Twitter. What's this page done? And they're verified on top of it. Verified Twitter user admits being a digital attacker.
JF, they're writing Twitter's terms of service. They're not just allowed on the platform, they write the rules.
Wow.
Okay. So, and again, it's all about the frame games. For Share Blue is positioned to frame opposition research as well as all leaks and intel. They're already talking about their leaks and intel before the man's even in office. So anyway, this just shows the network. And what I was going to get into if we had more time was the revolving door between mainstream media and establishment politicians. And one of the reasons that they scratch each other's back. Some good examples of this are are Brennan and John Brennan and James Clapper recently getting gigs at CNN. Mm-hmm. Right, this is like the former top honchos of the intelligence committees. As soon as their career is wrapped up and they get kicked out of office by Trump, what do? They get hired by the mainstream media. So it's the same thing you saw with the Jewish identity politics industry that we covered 2 weeks ago, right? They they scratch each other's back. They all give each other's jobs afterwards. They do favors for favors. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. There's so many systems of sticks and carrots. Anyway, there's a bunch more here, but their top outcomes. Okay, their top outcomes are for Trump allies being forced to step down or change course due to news we push. Again, 6 days into moving office. Their goal is to rid him of getting people in office. Under pressure from Share Blue, Democrats take more aggressive positions, achieve financial stability, but remember, they don't need to. They're like the Washington Times. Just a bunch of other stuff here. Relentlessly beating the drum that Trump has. Here are editorial priorities, JF. Non-stop coverage of the influence of Vladimir Putin and Russia on Trump and his administration.
These guys have, they control CNN. That's what CNN has done for months after this document was produced.
Non-stop. This is before the man is even in office, and they pledge non-stop coverage of the influence of Vladimir Putin and Russia. They've pledged to it before he's even in office, before there's even any evidence presented, before there's any Mueller probe, of which nothing has turned up in a year and a half. Actually, my first video, JF, I ever published to YouTube was a 3-minute rant tearing apart the 25-page CIA report on which the entire Mueller probe is based. I'll send it to you privately. It is fucking crazy. It's fucking crazy. There's nothing in the report. And what they do is the same thing that you do when you're trying to beef up the size of a legal brief. Half the pages have are basically blank with brackets saying, continued on the next page in order to get it up to 25 pages. Mm-hmm. And there's literally not a single piece of evidence other than the fact that Russia Today had a influential Twitter account and Facebook page, and that Russia Today had a motive because Putin would have preferred Trump over Hillary. That's literally what the entire thing is based on. And what you'll notice is the first 3 months of the entire Trump of the entire Russia campaign was all based on Russia Today and Russian and state-controlled Russian media. That was the flimsiest premise. I couldn't believe it because I was expecting it to be bad, but it was a total farce. It was very clear they had this pledge to do nonstop coverage in advance, and then the same deep state operatives who would later get jobs in the mainstream media agreed to basically work with media for the year to get this to drive the narrative.
All right.
But then look at how dehumanizing it all is. Exposing Trump as a weak, thin-skinned loser. Relentlessly beating the drum that he's the least popular president-elect in modern history. He hasn't even had a day in office, and we already are going to relentlessly beat the drum that he's the least popular ever. By the way, please keep that in mind when you look at polls about his favorability rating. Right? This is their top editorial priorities for the entire media complex. Sorry, I'm yelling so much, but I really get, I think it's important to fight outrage fatigue on our side.
It's it's as if they had anticipated that they didn't have that much. It's like people are going to get tired of our drumming.
Yep. Now look at this. Look at how they police their own side. They're going to give a carrot, positive coverage to Democrats who call out Trump and work aggressively against him, pressure on Democrats who consider giving him cover. If one of you Democrats, this is before the man's even had a day in office, or maybe he's had 1 or 2 days in office tops, he's, there you go. We're going to pressure any Democrat who even considers giving this man, giving the president of the United States cover until we impeach him. Mm-hmm. Right. And again, the whole overarching thing: media criticism exposing mainstream journalists who normalize Trump. Right, that gets us right back to, gee, why is it that you saw these articles about making sure that we don't normalize Trump? And remember the whole Jimmy Fallon thing, when Jimmy Fallon rustled Trump's hair on primetime TV,
Yeah.
and then the next day there were 30 different news outlets who said that Jimmy Fallon should be held accountable for normalizing Trump by engaging in the cuddly action of brustling his hair. Here, I'm going to show you that just so
it
you have
was
to
already
see
planned.
it. Right, it was because here you have the top-down priorities for the highest people in the hierarchical sponsor structure of mainstream media, saying that our top journalistic priorities are to expose other people on our side who normalize him and pressuring those who give him cover. If you work with the president, you're going to be fucked by our media machine, is what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, all right, let's just get down to this. I mean, the whole thing, it goes on. There's a bunch more odious stuff, but I can.
Yeah, we can move to the conclusion of the Share Blue part, because I do have a trailer to show the crowd. I did some research on the journalist scandal, but we can conclude that before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sorry. There's only a couple pages left that I want to cover in particular. So again, what they're going to try to do is get all Democrats to echo the Share Blue message. Okay, I guess I've been through enough of this. I guess we can move on for now. But please, I left a lot of stuff out. So if you guys, I'll throw the link in the description. Please look at this for yourself too, if you're curious in learning more.
Absolutely. Now, you also talked about Operation Mockingbird. I don't know what that operation is.
Well, Operation Mockingbird is what I would call it's one of these things like COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence. It's basically, here, I'll just send you the Wikipedia so that you can follow along with me while I show it to you. But it's a alleged CIA program for which there was congressional testimony supporting this. Let me throw this up to you here. That basically said that there are CIA operatives all over the mainstream, media. They've been in there for like 2 generations. There's basically an inside guy in intelligence communities, from the CIA to I think to the FBI and some other organizations. Here, I'll just send you this link on Twitter, since I can't find the lobby. But here you go, and then I'll pull it up on my screen so you guys can follow along. But this is a sort of widely believed but not fully proven theory about what's driving part of the revolving door between these deep state operatives like James Clapper and John Brennan and all these other leakers in the State Department, in the Department of Justice, and the CIA and the FBI, and that there is coordination of public relations between this entrenched political class and the mainstream media, in part because the CIA installed them a long time ago, and they've now developed a lot of infrastructure in the operation of mainstream media. So here's what the entry says, is just a cursory overview. So it was an alleged large-scale program of the CIA beginning in the early 1950s to manipulate mainstream news media for propaganda purposes. It funded student and cultural organizations. It recruited leading American journalists into a propaganda network and basically oversaw their operations. There, in the 1970s, and this is the part that we know to be true. We don't know the implications beyond this, but there were congressional investigations and reports in the 1970s that revealed the CIA connections with journalists and civic groups. And there's some pretty amazing quotes on this. Here is, let's see. All right, so here's one from Rolling Stone, which said that the CIA director had major influence over 25 newspapers and wire agencies. That some of them were very large, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a few other organizations. And here is what the report concluded: that the CIA maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence opinion of these mainstream news organizations through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio stations, etc., and that about 50 in the 1970s of the CIA's assets, that is, men and women, were individual American journalists and employees of U.S. media organizations. About half of them were accredited, meaning belonging to the CIA, the CNN, New York Times type variety. Basically, like it's a theory about the revolving door, that it's not just that there's several generations of infrastructure and likely a whole cottage industry just between what we colloquially call the deep state, leaving aside the DNC itself, leaving aside racial and ethnic and gender politics. Like there's a separate set of like entrenched power brokers that are pretty much inside guys at mainstream media. I don't know how much of it I believe, but that's what Operation Mockingbird is. And
all right, do you mind stopping to share your screen, because I get feedback loops with your.
Yep. Give me 1 sec here.
All right.
Okay, cool. Are we good now?
Yep, we're good now. So if you have links, you can just send them to me and I will display them on screen.
All right, great.
All right, so we have Operation Mockingbird, which there is some evidence for it. We have the Media Matter Share Blue memo. Was there anything else you wanted to discuss in that section?
Yeah, one other thing, because this is on the general topic of collusion and making sure you don't think that these organizations are independent. None of them are an island. They all feed back off of each other. Was the journalist scandal. So did you read about the Daily Caller expose on the journalist scandal and collusion?
Absolutely. Today I did some research on this since you brought it to me, and I did a little fun trailer for you guys to learn about the facts. And so the next 5 minutes is a trailer explaining to you the journalist scandal. In an ideal world, you would want journalists competing to be the quickest and most accurate at informing their audience. But as we know, this ideal was never quite reached by mainstream media journalists, who rather than working in the interest of their audience, have become a class of political agents who do not hesitate to use intimidation, coordination, and obfuscation of facts to further their political agenda. We often have only a glimpse at the coordination process for such malevolent action undertaken by mainstream media journalists, because unfortunately, they are still very successful at hiding most of their political plots from the public eye. However, the case of the journalist scandal gives us an insight into the process that mainstream media journalists engage in, thanks to their discussion group, in this case having been leaked. The story begins with the revelation of previous Reverend Wright footage, where Wright refers to a certain group of people in America as enemies.
Barack knows what it means to be a black man living in a country and a culture that is controlled by world. Jesus taught me how to love the hell out of my enemies.
Due to the association between Reverend Wright and Barack Obama, it was only fair for ABC News journalists during the presidential campaign to ask Barack Obama about the circumstances and the extent of his dissociation from Reverend Wright. This is the question that was asked to Obama on ABC News. But what did you know about his statements that caused you to rescind that invitation? And if you knew he got rough in sermons, why did it take you more than a year to publicly dissociate yourself from his remarks? A fair question, but not for a certain group of leftist mainstream journalists who were coordinating behind the scenes. Thanks to the journalist leaks, we now have access to their reactions to this question. George being a disgusting little rat snake, wrote Richard Kim, expressing disgust at the idea that a journalist would ask a challenging question to Barack Obama. Jewish journalist Spencer Ackerman, who in 2017 became the senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast, had a great idea to deflect the attention of the public from the link between Obama and Wright. Let's pick any of his opponents, Fred Barnes, Karl Rove, who cares, and call them racist. That gives us insight into the serious journalistic process that goes into calling someone a racist. Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. Michael Tomasky, now journalist at the Daily Beast, explained it crudely that ABC News was now an enemy, when he wrote, "Listen folks, in my opinion, we all have to do what we can to kill ABC and this idiocy in whatever venues we have." Thomas Shaler, political science professor at UMBC, thought that what we needed was to oppress journalists into not asking this kind of question. He had the idea of intimidating future journalists by releasing a negative statement. Why don't we use the power of this list to do something about the debate? It would create quite a stir, I bet, and be a warning against future behavior of the sort. But perhaps the prize for the most shocking commentary concerning these discussions goes to Jewish journalist Spencer Ackerman, who stated, "What is necessary is to raise the cost on the right of going after the left. In other words, find a right-winger and smash it through a plate glass window. Take a snapshot of the bleeding mess and send it out in a Christmas card to let the right know that it needs to live in a state of constant fear." Obviously, I mean this rhetorically. Oh, thank you. The group of journalists finally succeeded at getting their letter going against ABC News covered in the New York Times, and we can now understand that this was done with the intent of intimidating journalists into not asking any challenging question to Barack Obama. A very shady sort of affirmative action, if you will. This journalist leak has allowed everyone to see what everyone could have guessed before, that mainstream journalists are not interested in a search for truth. Rather, they are political agents coordinating behind the scenes to pile on people with false epithet, and they will use intimidation amongst themselves to keep certain stories from being covered if it can advance their ideology. Keep that in mind next time you browse to one of these mainstream outlets.
That's awesome. that was totally awesome.
All right, so this little documentary reminds us that, I mean, these people, and I've seen it down to the Kraut case. When Kraut went after me, I've seen cases of coordination between these YouTubers. And that's what they do. They gather together and they're like, they form think tanks at whatever level they are, and they decide what will be the items of the week, and they target specific people and they go for it. And this journalist case was a case where we had their entire forum of discussion because their group was hundreds of leftist journalists in a Google group list, and so it was easily leaked by one of them, presumably.
Yep. Well, I mean, look, this is what they This is the strategy. I mean, it is to rule by making an example out of one individual person. It prevents everybody from wanting to suffer the same fate. And you already have the highest levels of the Clinton, a machine, and of the DNC apparatus, which, remember, systemically favored Clinton, and also because of all the slush fund money with the Clinton Global Initiative. But they have a hit out for any journalist who deviates from this, right? Like, remember all of the references throughout the strategy memo about what they would do to journalists who made any attempt to normalize Trump or to present things in an even-handed manner. If they don't take the identical, outrageous, aggressive, full-throated, bombastic line that the mainstream media has taken unflinchingly for the past year and a half. So that's why you see this media phalanx about it. And as far as I can see, I mean, everyone seems to apologize the moment that they, as left-wing journalists, say something that may have accidentally normalized Trump.
Absolutely, and that's a sign that these extortion tactics, they do work. And the journalist scandal is just one of them, but your document shows that they intend to use this wherever possible, essentially.
Yep, and I wanted to show you some other examples of this. Like, there was recently a Al Jazeera documentary on the Israel lobby, and I'm gonna send you this link right now, and the link is going to have the starting location on it. This is an undercover expose of the Jewish identity politics takeover of much of, or I shouldn't say takeover, but their influence campaigns on British government and on British media. And here I'm gonna clip this right here. Here is a messaging media from the public affairs team, the public relations team of the Israel lobby in Britain. I'm just sending this to you on Twitter along with the start location. And what you're going to see is the exact same thing, where they say, listen, here's what we have to do. The best thing to do is not engage in debate at all. This is after they acknowledge certain points. Not to engage in debate at all, but to just call them racist, sexist, misogynist. That's the way to win nowadays. These are the strategy meetings of the highest levels of lobbyists and media influencers. So I just sent that to you. If you play,
we're listening to it right now.
Yes, this is a 4-part series by Al Jazeera on the Israel lobby in Britain. It has an amazing history because it was so damning that Al Jazeera actually did a similar one on the Israel lobby in America, and AIPAC threatened such holy hell against Al Jazeera if they dared release their undercover expose on AIPAC's relationship with American media, that Al Jazeera put it in the memory hole. It's unbelievable. I mean, they basically got coerced into not releasing an undercover expose that was, well, you have to watch this really to understand it in context.
To be clear, this is Al Jazeera investigating. Who are they exposing?
Well, what they show, this is an undercover, basically someone from Al Jazeera went to meetups for young professionals who wanted to support Israel and get involved in the Israel lobby. And him being taken under the wing of a big mover and shaker, and then doing secret hidden camera footage of this guy telling journalists about which PMs he wanted to take down in media, offering to trade favors for favors, threatening all sorts of ridiculous tactics about just basically taking someone down for like false claims of racism and anti-Semitism, or I should say indiscriminate claims, just to accomplish political goals. It's a 4-part series. Each episode is about 15 minutes. I highly encourage it. What I'm showing you is about a minute of the clip from part 3.
All right, I'll be starting to play now. The crowd will hear it, but you won't hear it. I'm starting at 3:20. Go.
Why are people who consider themselves progressive in Britain supporting reactionaries like Hamas and Hezbollah? We've got to say, in the language, I think, of social democracy, These people are misogynistic. They are homophobic. Right? They are racist. They are anti-Semitic. They are reactionary. I think that's what we need to say. It's an important message.
Jeremy Newmark, the chairman of the Jewish labor movement, reveals how the message worked with a close ally of Jeremy Corbyn.
So they're talking about making propaganda into the UK. I'll keep playing.
Yeah. So it's been basically, look, what they're doing is they're talking about a political opponent who they just want to get out. Like there's a great thing in part 4 where they show the takedown of this guy basically saying, listen, you know, we can help you out if you get this guy taken down in a scandal. I mean, these kind of things where like there's no journalistic integrity. There's no search for the truth. They're public relations front offices. And here's the link that shows the concerted attempt to stifle the airing of the similar expose on the U.S. in the U.S. But look, it's all about public relations, and control of the media is control of public opinion. So, those are a lot of the main themes. How are we doing on time?
I mean, we're headed toward conclusion, so I think that was our last point, right? And we can look at the super chats once you're done.
Yeah, let me. While you're looking at the super chats, I'll check out. I wanted to get into what drives the anti-white obsession, particularly, and the big business of identity politics there. But we can do that another time.
All right, let's have a look at the super chats. A fistful. This one I read. Okay, this one I read too. We were at tactical boomerism. First name, last name. Alt-right. Face it. This one I read. Where was I? Robert Crawford says, JF. Okay, this one I read too. Okay, I was there. Frederick White says, after the show, check out E. Michael Jones. I keep receiving messages about E. Michael Jones. We will invite him at some point. It's just a matter of scheduling and of waiting for the right moment. The funny thing is, the guy who keeps reminding me about E. Michael Jones, he wants to attract my attention, so he makes a comment on each of my YouTube videos, and he adds dollar signs at the top of the comment. He's like, JF, dollar signs. I need your attention. He thinks he's gonna trap me with dollar signs. Really you got funny. The wrong guy. Good Time says, broken nose, lips, shoulder, bone, and ribs. So he's in a bad spot. He says, a good evening for learning. Frame game is great as usual. Zdes says, another guest suggestion, Piero San Giorgio. I'll keep a note on him. Successful wheelchair technician says, Jeff looks tired. Sub to frame game. All right, well, I'm not tired at all. I'm always a relaxed guy, and I like hearing frame games. Muff Ed says, Howard Schultz is leaving Starbucks as CEO and considering a run for president. Seattle politics are insane. You haven't seen anti-white yet. Oh yeah, if this guy becomes a president, it's going to be the most SJW campaign ever. Robert Crawford says, FJ and JF. With all these tactics in mind, is it ever possible to defeat an institution from within its own framed game? If so, how? If not, then which option on my continuum is best? Well, I would say personally, I'm not black-pilled by what frame game reveals there. It shows that everything we've seen in terms of symptoms that I've complained about for months is a laid-out strategy. This is what people have planned. Now, on my side, how do we counter this? Well, first, YouTube and the fact that independent journalists and individual people who have no political links at all, like me, the fact that we are dominating the market more and more is good news for all of this to maybe not be gone at any point, but at least we're tickling them under the feet a little bit. Now, you ask about the strategy specifically. Use their language and turn their logic against them. 2 days ago, I found out by Styx that that Right Wing Watch had taken 2 of my videos on YouTube. I put 2 YouTube copyright strike on their ass, and in fact I tweeted that I felt that as a white male binary heterosexual minority, I felt that they had violated my minority rights by copying my videos. And so that kind of thing, it's like dynamite. It's all of their words, but it's you that's owning them. I say go for that kind of strategy. Use their words against them, use their strategies against them. Frame Game, did you have anything, any insight?
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and JF, I'm super stoked to do an episode with you about like top 10 strategy solutions and tactics to implement to advance the cause and the movement. But with respect to media, I do not think, given the current state of mimetic gravity of critical concepts, that you can do judo against the mainstream media. I'll give you like a quick example, right? So judo is like using the force of the other person against you. Jiu-jitsu uses the same martial arts principles. And that works really well if you're 120 pounds and you're going up 150 pounds. You know what it doesn't work against? Someone who's 400, doesn't work against Bob Sapp and these like superhuman, like, you know, tank muscle dudes. The same moves don't work.
Bob Sapp got owned by an 80-pound Japanese guy.
Was he 80?
I don't know, but he was small.
Well, it wasn't from judo, right?
The point is, in our current society, there's never been more chance for it to work. For my kind of approach to give results. I'm looking at my freaking stream. I'm looking at the Al Jazeera stream. Al Jazeera, a multiple employee mega corporation. They beat us by a few hundred viewers. Do you realize the world we live in, Frame Game?
JF, imagine if 2017, if that media matter strategy hadn't been concocted, you know how long it takes to develop a brand. I know, as someone who started a company, this stuff all snowballs. Like Worski, love him. You know, he's got like 300,000 subs, but it takes 12 years to develop that. Imagine if tomorrow he had to start from scratch. It would take another 12 years. Imagine where we'd be if organic demand had been allowed to express itself, if they hadn't destroyed freedom of expression and freedom of association in 2017 as an emergency response to authoritarian, use a sort of authoritarian communist dictatorship over the control of American information. Imagine that. Imagine all the people who've had to build up their Twitters from zero. That stuff snowballs. Shame on them.
I'm not even sure if you're still adhering to your original position or if you're changing your mind.
No,
the future is in the hand of independent individuals.
Yeah, well, I was actually sort of doing that, you know, as like a sort of theatrical moral rallying cry to the troops in the audience. And, was kind of hoping, since we're trending towards the end there, to kind of send people off with an emotional zinger so that people are like, yeah. Because I do think a sense of righteous moral authority is one of the most piercing swords that you could, it amplifies the power of your frame to a fucking ridiculous degree. Like if you can hold frame of moral superiority and moral righteousness, like it just renders so many SJW tactics instantly impotent.
Absolutely.
So I want people to get in the habit of accusing the other side of shame.
Robert Crawford says, Jeff, what really is love in your view? Since you are atheistic, where does the apparent spiritual aspect originate? And FJ, your thoughts? Well, on my side, love is a set of feelings that were implemented virtually into our brain systems for the purpose of facilitating reproduction and properly weighting the importance of having a sexual partner that's compatible for the production of babies. What about you, FG?
Oh my gosh. You know, there is an absolutely amazing 90-second response to this exact question that I clipped to use in a video for this week from George Lincoln Rockwell when an interviewer asked him the exact same question. And here is how he replied. I have it saved on my computer, but it's at like second 51 of a video I'm going to show you minute 51 of a video I'm going to show you right now, or just posting the link for you. But here's how he he defines it as, he says, there are two. The purpose of life is to struggle bravely, righteously, valiantly, and unrelentingly towards your higher purpose, and love is the dedication to do that, like with or without reward, because your dedication to the purpose is so supreme that it's its own form of love. Like it's something that's that makes life worth living, even if you are an atheist, because you are driven by something sort of supremely above you. It's, even if you don't believe in God, you can believe in humanity. And, to have that level of dedication is a form of sort of religion of itself. And it takes on love when you love it hard enough.
What a
I'll find
cock,
it.
Commander Rockwell. I'm not impressed by your performance. Robert Crawford says, FG, your view on the best religion for whites: Catholicism, Orthodoxy, paganism, something else? JF, your view on his response. All right, FG first.
Oh, fuck. My first temptation is to be just totally like naked and say, I don't know, man. There's so many like positives and flaws about every single one of them. And it really, have you ever played StarCraft, like Brood War back in the day, where like you've got like 3 races and like they all have like, there's like this evolutionary arms race, and they all have these counter strategies that evolve to each other, and it developed its own meta. That's kind of the way I see Judaism, Protestantism, and Catholicism. Like you have. It was really instructive to me, actually, since we've mentioned E. Michael Jones a number of times this stream. I disagree with E. Michael Jones on a lot of things. Let me say that in a not subversive way. I totally respect the guy. He's done amazing literature. He's like Kevin McDonald on that level. But in my view, like he's like so hardcore against a biological explanation for anything that you're gonna have shitty prediction if you take his model like without supplementing it with a certain amount of like race realism. But he describes the interplay between Jews, Catholics, and Protestants beginning in the early 20th century, and how the 3 of them jockeyed for dominance, and how their ideologies sort of evolved, mutated, intermingled with one another. And I would recommend you reading The Slaughter of Cities in order to really, and he's actually got some great YouTube things. If you don't want to invest in reading the book, he's got a ton of lectures on it. Please check it out. It's a great piece of work.
So on my side, I don't favor any of these religions. Maybe I would prefer Catholicism in its goodness and its generosity, but it does open weak flaws in societies that I don't like. So maybe a reformed sort of Catholicism that keeps the generosity, but within the people who agree to reciprocate with the same generosity.
JF.
What?
JF, I just thought of a great answer.
What?
Okay. All right. I got it now. All right. So I think that, because the question wasn't what I would prefer, right? It's what is best for a white person in the year 2018 right now, right? And what I would say is that I think that for people who are Christian, I'm obviously very proud of being Jewish. I know it doesn't come across all the time, but I really couldn't imagine myself like being faithful, with any other religion, just because there's so much of like a mental matrix to the Jewish mindset. But what I would advise for Christians to do with respect to adapting to the genocide occurring with respect to white Gentiles is to do what Jews did with respect to adapting certain direct confrontational and like Jews actually adopted a lot of Gentile techniques beginning in the 1920s.
All right, Quebec, thank you so much for the big donation, $200. I read your stuff earlier. Mode says, the media can unthing everyone all they want, but have not yet an infrastructure to deny observable reality, only spin. Apple Fritter says, the so-called white race Alright, I will not read the rest. Successful wheelchair technician. Press 1 for blondes, 2 for brunettes. And the chat answered by pressing 3 for red hairs. And I pressed 3 too. Padre Speaks says JF is in awe completely. Frame Game has taken the dark side of manufacturing consent and exposed it. He has revealed the weapon. Frederick White says great show, great information. Secret Genius says fake news is a slur against journalists and Americans. Justin Flemings says there's no such thing as communist subversive. Who are the good guys? Joshua Snyder says you enjoy the privilege of clean bottled water because of the oppression and exploitation of the cheap labor of people who themselves don't have access to it. Secret Genius. Secret Genius says redundant communication networks will defeat censorship efforts. Sorry. Aztec Pride says don't forget to sage the so-called share blue shills. H Rogue says does FG have his notes for these shows archived somewhere? And or is there a link to his sources for his presentation? I will try to copy the most important sources in the description. Robert Crawford says frame exposing the Operation Mockingbird. H Rogue says FG is best guess. UKISS is best girl. By the way, do you know if she's alright, Jeff? She seems to have gone Mia on Gab. Yeah, Emily is doing good, but she's just very concentrated on her work right now, so she doesn't have much time to do streaming. Caesar did nothing wrong. Says, take my shekel, JFN Frame. Good job naming the so-called media. Zed says, link to the memo, please. I will be putting some links in the description. I will include the memo. Commissar Gulagstein says, I got some shekels. All right, thank you for your shekels. H Rock says, regarding FG wanting to use strategy in his solution. Jeff, even dare rely on deception to force predators to break cover. Don't adhere to the truth so autistically. Well, the mission in my life is to bring back truth into the public space. And as far as autism go, my promotional slogan is autism is the new sexy. Justin Fleming, FG, that's exactly how I understand it. Shit has got to be raised, bricks have to be laid, not thrown to build toward victory. And Frederick White says, is GSP a Québécois? He looks Nordic. GSP is a true Québécois. He lived in a town where we were going to buy moose sausages, and we were going to buy the products of hunting, and these sausages were absolutely amazing. They were done by a local butcher. I wanted to have his recipe, and this fucking asshole died without giving me the recipe for the sausages, just because he was too close to his money. He really wanted to make cash out of his special sausage recipe until he died. You should have put this recipe on the public space. FG, Frame Game, I think we are done. Was there anything else you wanted to explore before we conclude?
I think this is good for now. I had a great time talking with you tonight, JF, and to the chat too.
All right, it was great talking to you. And as usual, your reports are in-depth and very challenging for the mind, but extremely interesting. So thanks for coming, and thanks for everyone for watching us.
See you next week.